My name is Ethan, and I'm 32 years old. I never imagined that a weekend escape into the rugged wilderness of Ohio would turn into a nightmare I'd never forget. But as I sit here, pen trembling in my hand, I know that some things defy explanation. It all began on a crisp Friday morning. I, along with 4 of my closest friends, Sarah, Jake, Lisa, and Mark, had piled into my slightly outdated RV. Our destination was a secluded clearing off an old trail near Wayne National Forest. I had hoped this trip would be the perfect antidote to our stressful urban lives, a chance to reconnect with nature and ourselves. Instead, it turned into a battle for survival against an ancient, malevolent force. Driving along winding back roads with trees looming on either side, the air already hinted at something off-kilter. The RV's engine coughed and sputtered as if it were warning us about the treacherous terrain ahead. Jake, ever the skeptic, cracked jokes about our rusty getaway vehicle, but even his humor couldn't mask the underlying tension that seemed to emanate from the dense woodland. We finally reached our destination just as the sun began its slow descent behind a canopy of gnarled oak trees. I parked the RV in a clearing, its worn tires crunching on the gravel as if announcing our arrival to the silent forest. With equipment that was less than reliable, a malfunctioning generator and flashlights that seemed determined to fail at the worst possible moments, we set up camp. Despite these setbacks, Lisa's bright optimism shone through. She coordinated setting up our tents and even managed to fix a couple of minor issues with quick, determined fiddling. That first evening, the forest appeared almost too quiet. The usual sounds of wildlife were muted, and an eerie stillness blanketed our clearing. As darkness fell, subtle signs of unease began to reveal themselves. While gathering firewood, Sarah noticed strange scratch marks carved deep into the bark of a towering pine. They were not random. They formed a pattern that, in her own soft, hesitant voice, she claimed resembled ancient symbols from local legends. I shrugged it off as the work of some territorial animal, but deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were not alone. Around the campfire, our conversation turned to local folklore. Sarah, with her inherent interest in legends, reminded us of the Lady in White, a ghost said to wander these parts, a sorrowful figure clad in a flowing white dress. Mark's eyes darkened as he listened. His voice trembled when he recounted childhood tales of the apparition, warning us that her presence portends misfortune. I, trying to maintain my pragmatic nature, offered a skeptical smile, though a slight chill had settled in my bones. It wasn't long before the first undeniable sign of our impending nightmare arrived. As I lay awake in the RV that night, struggling to ignore the rhythmic creaking of the old vehicle, I caught sight of something moving in the periphery of my vision. I stepped outside, flashlight in hand, and saw what I could only describe as a vague silhouette drifting between the trees, a figure that wore an aura of melancholy and forewarning. The figure, draped in what appeared to be a long white dress, didn't move in a manner consistent with any normal human. It floated, its presence unnervingly silent. I called out, but the only response was a distant, echoing whisper that mingled with the rustle of the leaves. By morning, a heavy tension had gripped our small group. Mark's anxiety was palpable. His constant murmurs about the curse of this place only deepened the chill that had taken root in our hearts. Our equipment continued to fail us. The RV's power flickered intermittently, and our communication devices remained stubbornly silent. Jake's sardonic quips began to lose their luster as even he couldn't entirely dismiss the oppressive feeling that something was amiss. Determined to keep our spirits high, we decided to take a short hike along a nearby trail, hoping that the daylight and fresh air would restore some semblance of normalcy. The forest, bathed in the gentle glow of morning light, initially seemed benign. but as we ventured deeper, the atmosphere shifted. The trees grew closer together, their branches intertwining overhead to form a natural vault that blotted out the sun. The scratch marks I'd seen the previous night reappeared along the trail, more frequent and more deliberate in their pattern. Sarah's voice dropped to a whisper as she suggested that these markings could be the work of something, or someone, trying to communicate. It was on that hike that we first encountered the full presence of the lady in white. We came upon an open glade, and there, standing at its center, was the spectral figure. She was breathtaking in her sorrow, a woman whose eyes held an unfathomable sadness, her white dress billowing around her as if caught in an unseen wind. Time seemed to slow as we all stared, paralyzed by a mix of fear and wonder. In that moment, even Jake's cynical bravado faltered, and Mark's usual anxious tremors escalated into palpable panic. The apparition did not speak, but its eyes, vacant yet accusing, seemed to pierce through our souls. For several agonizing minutes she hovered there, an eerie sentinel of the forest's ancient grief. Then, just as suddenly, she began to dissipate into the mist that had rolled in, leaving behind a silence so profound that it roared in our ears. That night, the supernatural presence grew ever more hostile. As darkness swallowed our campsite, the air turned frigid. A gust of wind, carrying with it a cacophony of mournful wails, shattered the relative peace we'd managed to muster. The RV's generator failed completely, plunging us into a darkness punctuated only by the flickering, unreliable glow of our failing flashlights. Panic set in as we huddled together, our previous banter replaced by whispered pleas and fearful glances toward the tree line. Amid the chaos, a series of violent events unfolded. I remember distinctly the moment when Mark, who had been nervously pacing near the RV, suddenly collapsed. I rushed to his side, my heart pounding in my chest. His face was twisted in agony, eyes wide with terror. Before I could even ask what was wrong, a force, unseen yet undeniably real, seemed to slam him against a tree. I heard his cries echo in the darkness, a sound that still haunts me. By the time I managed to reach him, Mark was beyond saving. His life had been snuffed out as if he were nothing more than a fragile candle flame in a tempest. His sudden, inexplicable death shattered whatever remaining semblance of safety we had. In the aftermath of Mark's demise, the group splintered into factions of grief, terror, and bitter skepticism. Jake, once our resident debunker, now looked at every shadow with the wide-eyed fear of someone who had seen true horror. Sarah was mute for days, her eyes haunted by unspoken memories. Lisa, ever the peacemaker, tried desperately to rally us, urging us to stick together and find answers in the old local lore that Sarah had mentioned. I, burdened with the responsibility of leadership and the crushing weight of guilt, felt compelled to do whatever it took to appease the malevolent force that had stolen our friend. We turned to the few scraps of folklore and historical accounts we could gather. Through hushed conversations with locals the next day, we learned that the lady in white was not merely a tragic figure, but the tormented spirit of a woman wronged centuries ago, a woman whose untimely death at the hands of a vengeful, cannibalistic cult of indigenous people had cursed these lands. According to legend, her spirit roamed the forest, seeking closure or retribution, and when disturbed, she could exact a terrible revenge. That night, as the oppressive atmosphere descended once more, we resolved to perform a makeshift ritual. Our plan was born from desperation and pieced together from fragmented tales passed down through generations. In the dim glow of our battered flashlights, we gathered in a circle in the very clearing where we had seen her the previous morning. The ritual was simple yet desperate. We were to recite an invocation in her memory, hoping that acknowledging her suffering might provide her with the closure needed to release her grip on the forest. I led the incantation, my voice trembling as I spoke words that had been etched in my memory from dusty, forgotten books. Sarah's eyes glistened with unshed tears as she added her own soft prayers. And even Jake's voice, usually so filled with derision, broke with emotion. Lisa held our hands together, urging us to remain united despite the terror that threatened to pull us apart. For a long, tense moment, nothing happened. The oppressive silence was so thick that it felt as if the forest itself were holding its breath. Then, from the darkness, the lady in white reappeared. This time, her presence was unmistakably violent. Her ethereal form contorted with anguish, and her eyes burned with a wrath that belied the sorrow she once embodied. The air around us vibrated with an energy that sent shivers down our spines. In that heart-stopping moment, I knew that the spirit was not merely a passive guardian of ancient wrongs. She was a force to be reckoned with, a vengeful entity whose wrath could not be so easily appeased. As her ghostly figure advanced toward us, the wind howled and trees creaked in protest, as if warning us to flee. In the ensuing chaos, our makeshift circle dissolved. Lisa clutched me, tears streaming down her face while Jake stumbled backward, his usual sarcasm replaced by raw, unadulterated terror. I tried to reach out, to calm her, to speak words of empathy, but the ghost's fury was overwhelming. In a flash of motion, she surged forward, and the clearing was filled with a cacophony of unearthly wails and the shattering of glass as our equipment was flung aside by unseen forces. I felt a searing pain as something brushed against my arm, a spectral touch that left a burning chill in its wake. In that moment, I understood that our ritual, our desperate attempt at reconciliation, was not enough. The lady in white demanded more than words and prayers. She demanded acknowledgement of the centuries of sorrow and injustice that had fueled her existence. As the confrontation reached its zenith, time seemed to slow. I saw each of my friends' faces etched with terror, and for a split second I wondered if I too would become another lost soul in this haunted forest. Then, as abruptly as it had begun, the spirit's rage subsided. With a final mournful cry that echoed through the trees, she receded into the darkness, leaving behind an oppressive silence and the heavy scent of decay. In the aftermath, we huddled together, our hearts pounding in unison, unsure if what we had experienced was a moment of terrifying release or a prelude to further horrors. The loss of Mark weighed heavily upon us, an ever-present reminder of the price we paid for trespassing into the realm of ancient grievances. We spent a sleepless night in that clearing, too frightened to move or speak, each of us lost in our own thoughts and haunted by what we had witnessed. As dawn broke, the first fragile light of day crept over the horizon, painting the forest in muted hues of gray and green. We made a collective, unspoken decision to pack up and leave. The forest, though breathtaking in its natural beauty, now felt like a graveyard of forgotten souls and unhealed wounds. The RV, our unreliable sanctuary, groaned in protest as we restarted its engine for what felt like the last time. In the days that followed, the journey back to civilization was fraught with tension and sorrow. We avoided talking about the lady in white, each of us unwilling to revisit the pain and terror that had unfolded in that cursed glade. Jake, once so sure of his scientific explanations, was now haunted by inexplicable nightmares. Sarah retreated into a silent melancholy, her eyes reflecting an unspoken understanding of the spirit's eternal grief. Lisa, ever the hopeful optimist, clung to the belief that somehow we had reached a fragile truce with the forces of the forest, and I, burdened by guilt, loss, and an insatiable need for answers, could only watch, silently questioning whether we had truly survived or if we had merely escaped the immediate danger with something far darker following in our wake. Months later, I still find myself revisiting that nightmare on Wayne's Trail. I've tried to move on, to rationalize the events as nothing more than a confluence of bad luck, unreliable equipment, and an overactive imagination fueled by local folklore. But deep down, I know that some part of me remains tethered to that haunted forest, to the sorrowful, vengeful spirit whose tragedy is woven into the very fabric of those ancient woods. Every time I drive past a dense copse of trees, I remember that chilling encounter. The ghostly figure in the white dress, the sudden gusts of wind, and the anguished cries that ripped through the night. I wonder if somewhere in the shadows, the lady in white still roams, searching for the closure that was forever denied to her. And as I live my life, a part of me is forever changed, haunted by the realization that sometimes the line between myth and reality is far thinner and far more dangerous than we dare to believe. That trip, that horrific confrontation with an ancient, tormented spirit, taught me that survival isn't just about battling the elements or patching up broken equipment. It's about confronting the dark truths of our past, the injustices that echo through time, and the ghosts that refuse to rest until they are finally acknowledged. And as I recount this story, I do so not only as a testament to the dangers of the unknown, but as a somber reminder that some nightmares never truly end. They simply wait, hidden among the trees, for the next unwary soul to venture too deep into the darkness. My name is Lucas, and I'm 45 years old. This happened in the autumn of last year, when I decided to take a long overdue solo trip to escape the clutches of my past. I drove my old RV out of the city, seeking solace and isolation on the edge of Zaleski State Forest in southeastern Ohio, a place whispered about in local legends and known for its eerie, unwelcoming vibe. The road out of the city was quiet, and the only sound was the steady hum of the RV's engine, a machine as worn and battered as my own spirit. I've carried a heavy load of regret and guilt for years, and I thought that perhaps solitude amid nature's unyielding silence might help me finally face those inner demons. The RV, with its creaking floors and persistent mechanical hiccups, felt like an extension of my own fractured life. As I navigated the twisting back roads, I couldn't help but feel that every rattling turn echoed my own unresolved memories. I arrived at the nearly abandoned RV park just as dusk was falling. The park was remote, surrounded by thick stands of trees that whispered among themselves in the fading light. There were only a handful of other vehicles scattered around, but none that stirred any real sense of community. I parked my RV on a vacant lot, its peeling paint and rusted edges a mirror of my own tired soul. I set up my few belongings inside, determined to make this quiet patch of earth my temporary refuge. The first night was strangely calm. I spent it reading old journals by the light of a sputtering lantern and letting my thoughts wander. But as midnight approached, I began to notice oddities that I initially dismissed as tricks of my tired mind. In the mirror above the sink, I caught a glimpse of a figure moving behind me, a flash of a person who wasn't really there. I chalked it up to the dim light and my own imagination running wild. After all, this was a place where even the smallest sound could be magnified by isolation. The following morning, I woke to a sense of disquiet. My reflection in the window of the RV seemed off. It was as if the image lagged behind my movements, a split-second delay that left me unsettled. I stepped outside for a breath of fresh air, hoping the morning light would clear away the remnants of a troubled dream. Instead, I noticed that some of my personal items, small things like my keys and a photo from my past, were not in their usual places. They had been moved ever so slightly, as if by a hand that knew exactly where they belonged. A chill crawled up my spine, and I wondered if I was losing my grip on reality. Determined to prove to myself that I was merely overworked and haunted by memories, I decided to take a short drive along the winding roads bordering the forest. I needed to clear my head, to see something other than the oppressive stillness of the RV park. But as I drove along a lonely stretch of road, I caught sight of something that made my blood run cold. A man standing by the roadside, illuminated briefly by a flash of lightning from an approaching storm. The man looked exactly like me. I slowed down, my heart hammering in my chest, and rolled down the window to call out. But before I could speak, the figure melted into the darkness, leaving behind only a series of muddy footprints that led directly to the RV's door. My mind raced. Had I really seen my own doppelganger? Over the next several days, I was relentlessly haunted by these anomalies. Every time I looked into a reflective surface, a window, a puddle after a light rain, even the polished metal of a discarded tool, I saw hints of someone who shouldn't be there. Sometimes it was a flash of a familiar face that mimicked my every move, a face that was my own, but with eyes that burned with an unsettling intensity. I started receiving cryptic text messages on my phone, even though I had no service here. They were brief, disturbing messages in my own handwriting. "It's not just you, and face your truth." I felt watched, tormented by the possibility that my own image was out to get me. Each night became a torment of inner turmoil and creeping dread. I tried to rationalize these events, telling myself that stress and solitude were playing cruel tricks on my mind. But deep down, I knew that there was something more sinister at work here, something that had a connection to the very land on which I now stayed. Unable to shake this growing paranoia, I ventured into the forest one misty morning in search of answers. The trees were ancient and imposing, their twisted limbs forming eerie silhouettes against the pale sky. I walked for hours, driven by a need to understand the strange occurrences. Eventually, I encountered an old hermit living in a ramshackle cabin hidden among the trees. His weathered face and piercing eyes told a story of long years spent in solitude and hardship. I hesitated, but desperation drove me to ask him about the legends of the area. In a raspy voice, the hermit recounted the local lore. He told me that these woods were cursed by a spirit, a doppelganger born from one's deepest guilt and unresolved trauma. According to the legend, the cursed land could manifest a person's inner demons as a physical being, a mirror image that existed solely to torment its victim. This entity, he warned, was relentless and dangerous, pushing its host towards self-destruction if they refused to confront the darkness within themselves. My stomach churned as I realized that every inexplicable occurrence, every haunting reflection, was not just a figment of my imagination, but a sinister manifestation of my own past. The hermit's words reverberated in my mind as I returned to the RV park. That night, the atmosphere grew heavy with the promise of a storm. The wind howled like the cries of lost souls, and the trees swayed as if in agony. I sat alone in the cramped interior of my RV, the silence broken only by the rhythmic patter of rain against the metal roof. I resolved that I had to face this manifestation head-on, to confront the doppelganger that had infiltrated my life. The entity's power, the hermit had said, was fueled by my own guilt and regret. Only by accepting and forgiving myself could I hope to weaken its grip. As the storm intensified, so did the signs of the doppelganger's presence. At one point, I caught sight of it in the dark reflection of a rain-soaked window, a perfect replica of myself, but with eyes that glowed with an unnatural, malevolent light. I felt my pulse race as the figure seemed to mimic my every movement. The messages on my phone continued, more insistent now, urging me to face the truth. I knew that I couldn't hide in this metal shell forever. I had to confront the specter, even if it meant facing the darkest parts of my soul. That night, the storm reached its crescendo. Lightning flashed across the sky, illuminating the RV park in stark, fleeting moments. In one such flash, I saw him again, a figure identical to me, standing just outside the RV. I froze, terror and determination warring within me. I knew I had to step outside. With trembling hands, I unlatched the door and stepped into the torrential rain, every step feeling as if I were walking toward my own undoing. The doppelganger waited at the edge of the clearing, illuminated by a harsh bolt of lightning that split the sky. Its eyes met mine, and in that moment I saw not just a reflection, but a mirror of every mistake, every regret I had ever harbored. The figure's lips moved, though no sound emerged. Only the low, insistent whisper of the storm filled the air. I summoned every ounce of strength I had and called out, "I'm ready to face you." For a long, agonizing moment, nothing happened. The rain poured down, masking every sound, until I saw the doppelganger's expression shift. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, it began to dissolve into the darkness, as if the storm were washing away the pain that birthed it. I stood there alone in the storm, heart pounding, feeling an odd mixture of relief and sorrow. Had I truly faced the darkness within, or had I only delayed the inevitable? The days following that night were a fragile balance of introspection and cautious optimism. I spent much of my time in the RV, journaling and meditating on my past, trying to come to terms with the guilt that had haunted me for so long. The strange occurrences gradually subsided. No more cryptic messages, no more eerie reflections that did not belong. I began to feel that maybe, just maybe, I had managed to break the curse that the land had imposed upon me. Yet the memory of that stormy night and the confrontation with my doppelganger lingered like a stubborn shadow. I continued to see hints of that spectral presence in the edges of my vision, a fleeting glimpse in a mirror, the echo of my own laughter that wasn't mine, but I no longer felt the paralyzing dread that had once threatened to overwhelm me. Instead, I felt a quiet resolve, a determination to keep moving forward despite the ghosts of my past. One particularly quiet evening, as I sat on the worn steps of the RV and watched the sun dip below the horizon, I reflected on the journey that had brought me here. The forest around me was alive with the sounds of nocturnal creatures and the rustle of leaves in the gentle breeze. The earlier terror seemed almost surreal now, a waking nightmare that had forced me to confront the darkest parts of my soul. In that moment, I realized that healing was not about erasing the past, but about acknowledging it, forgiving myself for the mistakes I could no longer change. I left the RV park a few days later, my heart lighter and my mind clearer than it had been in years. As I drove away along the winding roads, I could feel the oppressive weight of isolation lifting. The memory of my doppelganger remained, a reminder of the night I was forced to look deep into the mirror of my soul and accept the truths I had long denied. I knew that the journey toward healing was ongoing, and that the shadows of the past might always linger. Yet, I also understood that I now possessed the strength to live with them, to transform them into lessons rather than chains. Even now, as I recount this story, I feel the cool breath of that autumn wind on my face, a reminder of the storm that changed everything. I've learned that the greatest battles are often fought within, and that confronting one's inner demons is the only way to truly move forward. I may still see fleeting reflections of that other me in the mirror, but they no longer terrify me. They serve as a testament to the journey I've taken, a reminder that even in the darkest moments, there is hope for redemption. My name is Lucas, and I'm 45 years old. What began as a desperate escape into isolation turned into an odyssey of self-discovery amid the haunted woods of southeastern Ohio. I faced my past in the form of a spectral doppelganger, a mirror of my own guilt and regret. And in doing so, I learned that the path to healing lies in embracing all parts of oneself. I drive on now, with the open road ahead and the lessons of that eerie forest etched deep within me, ever aware that the truth is both a burden and a liberation. My name is Eric. I'm 35, and this is the story of the weekend that almost cost me my life. It all happened in the depths of Zaleski State Forest, Ohio, a place that promised a break from our daily grind but delivered a descent into a nightmare beyond imagination. I'd spent most of my life in the military, and while I left that chapter behind to work in IT, the instincts I honed back then never truly left me. That's why I naturally took charge when my three closest friends, Jenna, Mark, and Olivia, agreed to a much-needed getaway in an old RV. We craved solitude, nature, and the kind of bonding that only comes when you're miles away from civilization. Our plan was simple: a 3-day weekend of camping, hiking, and reconnecting with ourselves amidst the whispering pines of Zaleski. The RV we rented was far older than any of us expected. On our first evening, as we set up camp at a secluded clearing, the heater sputtered and the lights flickered ominously. Mark cracked a joke about vintage charm, but I couldn't shake a sinking feeling that our vehicle was as unreliable as our plans might be. We pooled our frustrations into laughter, but beneath the banter lay a current of tension. Jenna, our resident free spirit and freelance photographer, was the first to push for adventure. "Guys, this is perfect," she'd say, with eyes glinting at the possibility of capturing something unique, even macabre, in nature. Mark, ever the skeptic and graphic designer with a dry wit, remained unconvinced. "It's just an old RV in the middle of nowhere," he'd counter, though I sensed a crack in his facade as the shadows lengthened outside our temporary haven. Olivia, a gentle and empathetic school counselor, balanced us out with her quiet intuition. She always seemed to notice the subtle shifts in the atmosphere, like how the crisp autumn air carried a faint, unexplainable chill, or how the forest seemed to breathe a little too deeply around dusk. I trusted her instincts, though at the time I could only chalk it up to nerves. That first night, after a shared meal and some light conversation, the RV's faulty radio began to emit a low, steady hum. At first, we assumed it was just interference, but then the static wavered into what sounded like whispers, soft, pleading murmurs that slithered through the darkness. I couldn't help but listen intently, the voice almost intelligible, yet drowned by the hissing sound of broken signals. I dismissed it as an electrical anomaly, but deep down, I knew there was more to it. The following morning, we woke to a misty dawn that cloaked the forest in an eerie silence. Eager to explore, Jenna persuaded us to pack a light breakfast and trek along a narrow trail that snaked through towering hemlocks. Mark and I debated the route, Mark's skepticism clashing with my need for certainty, but Olivia's quiet urging eventually swayed us into following the path. As we wandered deeper into the woods, our laughter slowly gave way to a creeping unease. It wasn't long before we stumbled upon a series of large, oddly shaped footprints near the trail. They looked human at first glance, but bore an unmistakable animalistic twist, with elongated digits and an irregular pattern that defied any natural explanation. I knelt down, examining them closely, when a chill ran up my spine. "Guys, these aren't just bear tracks," I muttered, glancing at my friends. Jenna snapped a few photos, her expression a mix of curiosity and concern, while Mark scoffed, "Maybe it's a big dog, or something even weirder." Olivia, however, simply stared at the prints, her eyes wide with silent alarm. That afternoon, we returned to our RV to regroup and dry off. Over a hastily prepared lunch, we found ourselves discussing local legends with an elderly park ranger we encountered near the forest's edge. His weathered face grew grave as he recounted the disturbing history of the area, a tale of an indigenous cult that once roamed these lands, performing blood rituals and allegedly practicing cannibalism. According to local lore, the spirits of these dark rituals had never fully left the forest, their malevolent energy manifesting in various forms over the decades. I listened intently, a knot forming in my stomach as I wondered if our eerie encounters were connected to these long-forgotten horrors. That evening, as twilight bled into night, our RV's interior felt more like a fragile sanctuary than a secure shelter. The radio, now fixed in its unsettling behavior, played back intermittent snippets of low chanting, almost as if someone, or something, were reciting an incantation. The sound warped our once familiar surroundings into a distorted landscape of dread. I found myself double-checking every bolt on the RV and urging everyone to remain calm, though my own voice betrayed my inner turmoil. It wasn't long before the darkness outside revealed its true menace. We began to see shadows flitting between the trees, figures that moved with unnatural grace and seemed to vanish as quickly as they appeared. One particularly harrowing moment came just after midnight when I heard a rustling sound outside the RV. I crept to the window and peered out into the inky blackness. There, at the edge of our camp, stood a figure, tall, gaunt, and draped in an aura of malevolence. I couldn't make out its features clearly, but its eyes, or what I assumed were its eyes, glowed faintly, sending shivers down my spine. "Did you see that?" I whispered urgently to Jenna, who had come to my side. Her normally carefree demeanor had evaporated, replaced by a look of pure terror. Mark, always quick with a retort, murmured, "Probably just a trick of the light." But I could tell even he wasn't convinced. Olivia clutched her hands together, her eyes fixed on the darkness as if willing the figure away. The night wore on, and the oppressive sense of being watched never left us. It was as if the forest itself had come alive with a sinister intent, the very trees whispering secrets of ancient horrors. At one point, the radio emitted a clear, guttural chant that seemed to echo the words spoken by the old ranger. The voice was unmistakably unearthly, blending the human with the spectral, a call to rituals best left undisturbed. Our fragile peace was shattered when, during a brief power outage in the early hours of the morning, the RV was violently shaken by an unseen force. The metal frame groaned under the assault, and I instinctively reached for my sidearm, old training taking over as adrenaline surged through me. The door burst open with a crash, and before I could react, a dark, spectral figure lunged inside. Its form was both human and animalistic, contorting in ways that defied logic, and its eyes burned with an unholy light. I fired a warning shot into the air, the sound echoing like a death knell through the confined space. Chaos erupted. Jenna screamed. Mark ducked behind a corner, and Olivia cried out, her voice a piercing wail of despair. The figure paused, almost as if in deliberation, then vanished into the shadows with a speed that left us breathless. In the aftermath, we were left to piece together what had just happened, our minds racing with questions. Had we truly seen the remnants of the cannibal cult the ranger had spoken of? Or were these merely vengeful spirits, guardians of an ancient curse? The RV, already plagued by mechanical issues, now felt like a fragile bubble of safety amidst a hostile and unknowable world. Our discussions grew heated as fear took root. Mark's skepticism turned into bitter sarcasm, his usual humor now a mask for panic. Jenna's adventurous spirit had given way to a deep-seated dread, her camera lying abandoned on the table as she stared into the darkness. Olivia, whose empathy had once been her strength, now seemed haunted, as though she could see things that we couldn't, her eyes reflecting an internal battle between hope and resignation. We knew that staying put was a dangerous proposition. As dawn crept over the horizon, we gathered our few belongings and decided to make a desperate bid for safety. With the RV's mechanical failures still unresolved, we attempted to restart the engine, our hands trembling as we fiddled with the controls. The old vehicle coughed and wheezed, and for a moment, it seemed as if our escape might be possible. But then, as if the forest itself were determined to keep us trapped, the engine sputtered one final time and died. We were forced to abandon the RV and venture on foot along a barely discernible trail, our hearts pounding in unison as we retraced our steps toward what we hoped was civilization. Every snap of a twig, every rustle in the underbrush, was a potential harbinger of the horrors that lurked just beyond our vision. It was during this exodus that the true malevolence of our pursuers revealed itself. Without warning, we were ambushed by a small band of figures emerging from the trees, a ragged assembly of human-like shapes with an unmistakable air of savagery. Their movements were precise and predatory, a blend of human cunning and animalistic ferocity. In their eyes burned a feral intensity, and their ragged clothing hinted at ancient rituals and a savage way of life. They were the living remnants of the indigenous cult, cannibalistic, bloodthirsty, and driven by a dark purpose that defied modern reason. I shouted orders, trying to keep the group together as chaos reigned. Mark, who had so long insisted that there was a rational explanation, now found himself fumbling for a weapon, a length of broken pipe that he brandished with trembling hands. Jenna ran ahead, desperate to capture evidence of our attackers with her camera, though her actions only served to distract her. Olivia, however, remained rooted to the spot, her eyes locked on the nearest attacker as if trying to negotiate with the evil itself. In the ensuing melee, survival became a frantic dance of dodging, hitting, and screaming. I managed to fend off one attacker, adrenaline fueling my every move. But even as I fought, I felt the weight of inevitability. The figures were relentless, advancing in a coordinated, almost ritualistic manner. Their attacks were not random. They were precise, as if guided by an otherworldly force determined to reclaim the forest from the intruders. Amid the struggle, the RV's earlier whispers returned in my memory, the spectral incantations that had haunted our nights. In a desperate moment, I recalled Olivia's earlier words, a gut feeling that perhaps these forces could be confused or even appeased. Amid the terror, I grabbed a small rusted relic we'd found near the ranger station earlier, a talisman that local lore had claimed could ward off evil spirits if used correctly. With no time to lose, I hurled the relic toward one of the advancing figures. In an almost surreal twist, the attacker hesitated, as if the object had momentarily disrupted its malevolent focus. That brief pause allowed us to scramble, to break formation, and make a run for it into the labyrinthine forest. I don't know how long we ran. Time seemed to stretch into a disorienting nightmare. Branches whipped our faces, and the ground underfoot became treacherously uneven. Behind us, the guttural chants and frantic shouts of our pursuers faded in and out, replaced by an overwhelming silence that was almost worse than their presence. We finally reached a dilapidated ranger station hidden in a copse of dead trees. The building was barely intact, its windows broken and doors hanging off their hinges, yet it promised shelter. We barricaded ourselves inside, patching up the few broken planks we could find and securing any entry points with makeshift furniture. For a fleeting moment, we allowed ourselves to believe that we might have escaped the worst. Inside that desolate station, the true toll of our ordeal became apparent. Mark, who had been so sarcastic just hours before, now lay bleeding from a deep gash on his forehead, a wound inflicted during the frenzied escape. Jenna's eyes were haunted, and though she didn't speak much every time she clutched her camera, I saw a flicker of desperation mixed with the compulsion to document every horrific detail. Olivia sat apart, whispering softly to herself, as if in conversation with unseen entities. And I, burdened by the weight of leadership and the horrors we had witnessed, could only stare at the door, listening for the slightest hint of the supernatural menace outside. For hours, we huddled in that fragile sanctuary. The storm outside raged, thunder rolling over the forest in a macabre symphony, and in between the bursts of lightning, I could almost see the twisted silhouettes of our attackers prowling near the station. Sleep was a luxury none of us could afford. Every creak of the old wood, every whisper of the wind, was a reminder that our nightmare might resume at any moment. At dawn, with nothing but the shattered remnants of our hopes and our battered bodies, we made a grim decision. We would try to walk out of the forest, hoping to reach a nearby road and call for help. Olivia, despite her obvious distress, volunteered to lead us through the underbrush. "I have a feeling these woods know the secrets of our past," she murmured, her voice trembling yet resolute. "And maybe they'll show us the way out if we listen." Her words were cryptic, but in that moment they became a desperate mantra that tied us together. The journey was grueling. We moved as quietly as possible, trying to avoid drawing attention, our senses perpetually on high alert. The forest was unyielding. Every step was fraught with danger, every shadow a potential ambush. There were moments when the supernatural presence felt so heavy that it seemed to press down on our very souls, a palpable energy that was both suffocating and terrifying. As we pressed deeper into the heart of Zaleski State Forest, the line between myth and reality blurred further. The whispered chants we'd heard on the RV's radio now echoed in the rustling leaves, and every twist in the path seemed preordained by some ancient force. We encountered more evidence of the cult's lingering presence: crude symbols etched into tree trunks, remnants of ritualistic fires long extinguished, and even a tattered piece of clothing that looked all too human. Our final test came near dusk when the forest opened onto a small clearing illuminated by the dying light of the sun. There, in the center, stood a crude altar surrounded by torches that burned with an unholy blue flame. Figures emerged from the tree line, more of our attackers, their faces now twisted into expressions of both rage and sorrow. It was as if the forest had summoned them for one final rite. In that moment of confrontation, I felt the weight of every decision we'd made, every step that had led us to this horrifying climax. I shouted for everyone to scatter, to use the darkness as cover, but the attackers moved with the precision of ritualistic zealots. The air filled with the sound of clashing metal, desperate cries, and the rhythmic pulse of ancient drums that seemed to come from nowhere. For what felt like an eternity, I fought with every ounce of strength and training I possessed. I dodged and parried, trying to keep one step ahead of the madness. The talisman I'd thrown earlier glowed faintly in my hand, a reminder of the possibility that not all was lost. In a fleeting moment of clarity amid the chaos, I realized that the relic might be the key to breaking the cult's hold on this cursed place. With a surge of determination, I ran toward the altar, praying that I could use the talisman to disrupt whatever dark ritual was binding these spirits to the forest. I placed the relic upon the altar, and for a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. The attackers hesitated, their eyes flickering with uncertainty as the talisman pulsed with an otherworldly light. Then, as if the very fabric of the supernatural was being torn asunder, A deafening wail split the air, a sound that was both a cry of anguish and a release of pent-up rage. The torches faltered, and the figures around me began to dissolve into the swirling mist, their malevolence disintegrating as the cursed energy was finally exorcised. In that silence, broken only by our ragged breaths, I realized the truth. The supernatural force was not a mindless monster. It was the tragic, violent echo of an ancient cult, a manifestation of human cruelty twisted by time and ritual. The spirit of the forest had been a repository of their dark deeds, and now, in a desperate bid for survival, we had managed to disrupt that cycle. We were not entirely unscathed. Mark's injury, Jenna's haunted eyes, and Olivia's quiet, lingering despair bore testament to the ordeal. Yet, as the mist receded and the oppressive weight lifted from the forest, there was a glimmer of hope, a possibility of escape and healing. We eventually found our way to a small road at the edge of the forest, where a patrol car stopped to help us. The relief was palpable, but the scars of that night would remain etched in our minds forever. I often lie awake, haunted by flashes of those glowing eyes and the rhythmic chants that had once filled the night air. And though we eventually returned to our normal lives, each of us carried the burden of that night. A constant reminder that sometimes the line between myth and reality is all too thin. In the aftermath, as I sit here writing this account, I understand that the forest still whispers its secrets, and somewhere in the dark recesses of Ohio, those ancient evils might stir again. The memory of that talisman and the final agonizing wail of the cult remind me that survival is not just about escaping physical danger. It's about confronting the darkness that resides in the forgotten corners of our world and within ourselves. That weekend in Zaleski State Forest taught me that sometimes our past, and the legends we dismiss as mere folklore, come back to remind us that some horrors are eternal. I lost friends that night, and I nearly lost myself. But in the silence that followed, I found a resolve to carry on, even as the whispers of the dark woods continued to haunt my dreams. And so, as I close this chapter of my life, I do so with a heavy heart and a wary mind, ever watchful for the next time the darkness stirs, ready to reclaim what it believes is rightfully its own. My name is Thomas. I'm 42, and this is the story of the weekend that changed everything for me. A journey into the heart of Mohican State Park, Ohio, where the echoes of the past wove themselves into my grief-stricken soul. I had been an artist for most of my life, pouring my heart onto canvas in a desperate bid to capture feelings I couldn't otherwise express. After losing my wife 3 years ago, I found myself adrift in a sea of sorrow and regret. My art, once vibrant and full of life, had grown muted. In a final attempt to reconcile with my pain, I decided to rent my vintage RV and escape to a secluded lakeside spot in Mohican State Park. I needed solitude, a quiet refuge where I could sort through the memories and guilt that haunted me. I hoped that nature, in its endless cycle of renewal, might somehow heal the wounds of loss. The RV was a relic from another era, its faded exterior and creaking joints a stark contrast to the promise of serene isolation. On my first evening, as I set up camp near a quiet stretch of lake, I noticed that the old heater was acting up and the lights flickered as if in protest of their own frailty. I managed to fix a few minor issues, though I couldn't shake the unsettling feeling that my only company in this lonely place might be the ghosts of the past. That night, as dusk draped the landscape in shadows, I settled into the RV with a cup of lukewarm coffee. The air was cool and crisp, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth. Just as I began to feel the quiet comfort of isolation, I caught a glimpse of something out the window. a fleeting image of a woman in a flowing white dress standing at the lake's edge. I rubbed my eyes, certain that grief had conjured up a mirage, but when I looked again, the vision was gone. The image lingered in my mind, both haunting and inexplicably beautiful, as if it were an echo of something I had long forgotten. The next morning, I ventured outside to capture the peaceful scenery with my sketchpad and camera. The lake was shrouded in a delicate mist, its surface mirroring the awakening sky and the surrounding trees in a manner that seemed almost otherworldly. As I sat by the water, I began to notice something strange. When I looked into the reflections, I sometimes saw, for a split second, a figure in white moving among the trees. A figure that wasn't there when I turned my head. At first, I assumed it was a trick of the light, but the fleeting glimpses and the soft, melancholic humming that occasionally drifted across the water unsettled me deeply. I spent that morning wandering the perimeter of the lake, letting the landscape absorb my sorrow while trying to sketch the mood that enveloped me. As the day wore on, I discovered something unexpected tucked away near a cluster of trees, a series of curious, ritualistic markings carved into the bark. The symbols were intricate and strange, as if they were part of an old story that the forest itself had preserved. Nearby, I found a few scattered, weathered objects: a broken locket, a faded ribbon, and a scrap of paper with a partial newspaper clipping that mentioned a local legend. Piecing together the fragments, I learned of Emily, a young woman who had drowned under mysterious circumstances decades ago, leaving behind a tale of tragic love and unanswered questions. My heart pounded with a mix of sorrow and intrigue. Was it possible that the ghostly figure I had seen was Emily? Her legend spoke of a restless spirit condemned to wander the lakeside in a white dress, forever mourning a love lost too soon. As an artist whose soul had been steeped in grief, I felt a profound connection with her. Perhaps in her silent tragedy I could find the catharsis I so desperately needed. That night, back in the RV, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was not alone. The heater continued to sputter erratically, and the lights dimmed as if under the weight of some unseen force. While I tried to work on a sketch, I kept glancing up at the window, half expecting to see the spectral figure of Emily. Then, as a low hum permeated the stillness, a soft, sorrowful tune that seemed to emanate from the very walls of the RV, I felt my defenses crumble. The melody was achingly beautiful, and it stirred memories of happier times with my wife, along with a deep, gnawing guilt that I had never fully confronted. Sleep did not come easily that night. Instead, I lay awake, listening to the faint sounds of weeping and soft whispers, mingled with the rhythmic lapping of the lake's water against the shore. At times, I was certain that the sound was coming from outside, and other times, it seemed to resonate from within me. I was caught between a dream and a nightmare, uncertain whether my mind was replaying fragments of my loss or if the spirit of Emily was reaching out through the darkness. A violent thunderstorm broke the next evening, shattering the fragile calm of my retreat. Rain battered the RV, and lightning illuminated the darkened woods in brief, startling flashes. I sat huddled by the small, quivering light of a lantern, trying to steady my nerves as the storm raged outside. In one heart-stopping moment, as the thunder rolled overhead and the wind howled like ancient voices, I saw her, Emily, in full, sorrowful apparition, standing right outside the RV. Her eyes, filled with a deep and unspoken agony, met mine as though pleading for help. I remember the look in her eyes vividly. They were pools of infinite sadness, mirroring my own pain. I reached out instinctively, but she merely drifted back into the tempest, her form dissolving into the sheets of rain. I felt a surge of overwhelming empathy and helplessness. Here was another soul bound by sorrow, unable to find peace, and I couldn't help but wonder if our fates were intertwined. The next morning, the storm had passed, leaving behind a glistening, eerily quiet landscape. Determined to understand the mystery of Emily's lingering presence, I decided to venture toward an old, dilapidated cabin I had read about in the newspaper clipping. It was said to have once belonged to someone who had been close to her, a person whose secrets might hold the key to releasing her spirit. With a heavy heart and a sense of foreboding, I gathered my sketchpad, camera, and a few supplies, and set off on foot through the damp underbrush. The walk was long and solitary, the forest around me a tangled maze of towering trees and moss-covered stones. Every step felt weighted with anticipation and the unspoken promise of discovery. The further I walked, the more the lines between my grief and the haunting presence of Emily began to blur. I started to notice that the melancholic humming seemed to echo along the path, and every now and then I caught a glimpse of a white figure vanishing behind a tree or flickering in the distance. When I finally reached the cabin, it was nearly hidden by overgrown vines and the encroaching wilderness. The structure, though clearly abandoned, had an air of faded dignity, a silent witness to stories long past. Inside, dust motes danced in the weak morning light that filtered through broken windows, and the floorboards creaked underfoot as if whispering secrets. I explored room after room, each filled with remnants of a life that had been abruptly shattered. Among old photographs, tattered letters, and discarded keepsakes, I discovered a small diary. Its pages, yellowed and brittle, recounted the tragic tale of Emily, a young woman caught in a web of love, betrayal, and overwhelming sorrow. According to the diary, Emily had been the beloved of a local man whose passion had spiraled into a dark obsession. Their love had been intense, but doomed from the start, and in a fit of jealous rage or perhaps despair, he had cast her into the lake. The diary's final entries spoke of regret, unfulfilled promises, and a curse that doomed their souls to wander the land in eternal mourning. I sat there in the dim light, feeling as though the very weight of her despair was settling upon me. In that moment, I realized that my own grief had mirrored hers so perfectly. I had been unable to let go, trapped in a cycle of guilt and sorrow that left me haunted by memories of my wife. Returning to the RV with the diary clutched in my hands, I felt both a heavy burden and a strange sense of kinship with Emily. That night, I decided to confront the specter of my past head-on. With trembling fingers, I retrieved a letter I had written to my wife, a heartfelt confession of all my regrets and unspoken apologies, penned on the eve of her passing. In the dim light of the RV, I began to read it aloud, my voice cracking under the weight of raw emotion. I spoke not only to my lost love, but in some inexplicable way to Emily as well, inviting both of our tormented spirits to find solace and release. As my words filled the cramped space, a palpable shift occurred. The incessant humming quieted, and for a few long, suspended moments, there was only the sound of my voice echoing softly against the walls of the RV. I felt a presence close by, a gentle, almost imperceptible warmth that seemed to envelop me. And then, as if carried away on a sigh of relief, the oppressive heaviness lifted. I sensed that somewhere in that ethereal space, Emily had found a measure of peace, her mournful presence softening into something more like a bittersweet memory rather than a tormenting force. In the following days, the eerie manifestations gradually subsided. The flickering lights and sporadic weeping that had plagued the nights became rare occurrences, and the spectral figure of the white-dressed woman was seen only fleetingly, like a gentle echo on the lake's mist. I spent the remaining time at Mohican State Park slowly rebuilding myself. I sketched the scenes of the forest and the lake, each stroke of my pencil now imbued with a sense of bittersweet hope. I wrote in my journal, documenting not just the haunting but also the gradual lifting of a heavy burden I had carried for too long. When it was finally time to leave, I felt a mixture of relief and melancholy. I drove the old RV back to the small town at the park's edge, its mechanical quirks now a distant memory compared to the emotional journey I had undergone. The experience had been as painful as it was cathartic, a confrontation with both an external ghost and the inner demons of my own grief. I realized that while the memories of my wife would always be a part of me, the acceptance of loss was the first step toward healing. Looking back, I now see that Mohican State Park was not merely a backdrop for a ghost story. It was a crucible in which the boundaries between past and present, sorrow and solace were tested and ultimately transformed. The spectral presence of Emily, once a chilling reminder of a tragedy long forgotten by others, became for me a symbol of redemption, a call to release the guilt that had tethered me to a life of endless mourning. Even now, as I return to my studio in the city and pick up my brushes with renewed purpose, I carry the memory of that weekend with me. The images I create are richer, the colors more vibrant, and the sorrow that once darkened my palette has given way to a complex, hopeful melancholy. I still see fleeting glimpses of a white dress in my dreams, but now they are gentle reminders of a soul finally at peace rather than a haunting specter of despair. My time in Mohican State Park taught me that sometimes, in the depths of isolation, we are forced to confront the ghosts of our past, not to be consumed by them, but to acknowledge them, understand them, and ultimately set them free. In that quiet, forgotten corner of Ohio, I found not just the ghost of a tragic young woman, but a path toward my own redemption. And so, as I close this chapter of my life, I do so with a tender gratitude for the sorrow that once weighed me down. The white echo that had haunted the lakeside has faded into a memory of lost love and gentle forgiveness. A reminder that even the deepest wounds can heal when we allow ourselves to embrace the beauty of both grief and grace. This journey, marked by eerie whispers in the dark and the soft glow of catharsis, remains etched in my heart. It is a story of isolation and inner turmoil, a testament to the power of confronting one's own past in the quiet solitude of nature. And though I have moved on from that secluded haven, the lessons learned there continue to inspire every stroke of my brush, every line of my sketches, and every whispered note of the melody that now soothes rather than torments my soul. O Thrimini, voce dice. Give me another outline of a RV camping story with a different. My name is Marcus Reed. I'm 34 years old, and I never imagined that a weekend escape to Cuyahoga Valley National Park would become a fight for survival against forces beyond comprehension. It started innocently enough. My old friends, Jenna Alvarez, Travis Cole, and Sarah Kim, had planned this RV camping trip as a much-needed break from our chaotic lives. Jenna's passion for local folklore, Travis's daring spirit, and Sarah's quiet, sensitive nature meant that we were a motley crew, each bringing our own strengths and vulnerabilities. I'd always been the pragmatic one, my military background instilling in me a need for order and control. Yet, as we pulled off the beaten path into the dense heart of the park, I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the autumn air. We arrived late on a Friday afternoon, the sky a canvas of fading gold and purple, the RV's engine sputtering as if warning us of the trials ahead. I couldn't shake the feeling that our equipment was as old and unreliable as my memories of past misadventures. Our trusty, yet clearly aged generator rattled ominously that first night, leaving us in the dark cold as the temperature dipped. That first evening, as we set up camp on a small clearing surrounded by towering maples, The natural silence of the forest was broken by low, unidentifiable howls that echoed through the trees. I remember glancing at Sarah, whose eyes were wide with unease. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. Travis scoffed, attributing the noise to a pack of wild coyotes, but even his confident tone couldn't mask the tension that gripped us. The next morning, while Jenna was out for a solitary walk to photograph the autumn colors, the rest of us discovered something unsettling. Carved into the bark of a nearby oak were several circular symbols, crudely etched but undeniably deliberate. I recalled Jenna mentioning in passing that these symbols were reminiscent of local indigenous designs tied to ancient legends of shapeshifters, creatures that were said to be neither fully human nor animal, cursed to wander as the harbingers of doom. I showed Sarah and Travis the markings. Sarah's voice trembled as she murmured, "This isn't just vandalism, it's a warning." Our RV's troubles only compounded our growing anxiety. By mid-afternoon, the generator had completely given out, leaving us without reliable heating as dusk settled over the valley. With outdated maps and a faulty GPS, every turn felt like it was leading us deeper into the labyrinthine woods. I found myself caught between my instinct to keep us safe and the creeping suspicion that our isolation here was not entirely natural. That night, the forest became a theater of the bizarre. As I lay in my bunk trying to catch a few hours of restless sleep, I heard what could only be described as the soft, eerie laughter of children drifting through the trees. I bolted upright, my heart pounding, and called out, "Who's there?" But the only response was the rustling of leaves and a silence that felt as if the forest itself was holding its breath. Travis, ever the daredevil, insisted that we shouldn't be so spooked by nothing more than the wind and wildlife. But I noticed the tension in his eyes as he paced near the door of the RV, his bravado faltering for a moment. It wasn't long after that we saw a shadow, a vague, shifting figure moving at the edge of the campsite in the early morning mist. I was the first to react, grabbing my flashlight and heading outside. The beam danced over the dew-covered grass, revealing nothing but the heavy fog, yet I could almost swear I saw a pair of eyes glimmering briefly among the trees. That morning, as we gathered our wits over a cold cup of coffee, Jenna shared her findings from her walk. "I found an old journal in a rusted box near an abandoned cabin," she explained, her voice low with urgency. "It's filled with accounts of a cursed shaman, an indigenous man who was wronged and doomed to become a shapeshifter. Locals say his spirit now roams these woods, taking on different forms to terrorize anyone who disturbs his resting place." Her words sent a shudder through me. A cursed shaman, a being that could shift between human and beast, whose wrath was both vengeful and violent, was the stuff of legend. And yet, the evidence around us was mounting. The carved symbols, the inexplicable noises, and the shadowy figure all hinted at a presence that defied the natural order. We decided to set out on a short hike to a nearby, lesser-known trail Jenna had mentioned. It was our best chance to find clues and perhaps a way out of the mounting dread that enveloped us. But our trek was fraught with difficulties. The trail was overgrown, and our outdated navigation tools led us astray more than once. Group tensions flared when Travis, ignoring our better judgment, led us into a part of the forest that seemed to thicken the air with malevolence. "You have to trust me on this," he argued, when I protested against straying from the established path. "I've got a good feeling about where this is going." His tone was confident, yet there was a reckless glint in his eyes that made me uneasy. Sarah clung to me as we stumbled through the dense undergrowth, her anxiety palpable. Deep into our hike, the forest grew unnervingly silent. Birds that had been chirping moments before were suddenly mute, and even the rustling of leaves seemed to vanish. That's when we encountered the unmistakable evidence of our nightmare, a clearing ringed with the same circular symbols we'd seen near the RV. In the center of the clearing lay what appeared to be an altar, crudely assembled from stones and twigs, as if someone or something had performed a ritual. I felt a chill run down my spine as I realized we had trespassed on sacred, cursed ground. As dusk settled once again, we made our way back to the RV, our hearts heavy with dread. The night was punctuated by intermittent sounds that mimicked the voices of loved ones long lost, an auditory trick that disoriented us further. By that time, the group's cohesion was already fraying. Travis's earlier bravado had given way to irritation and defiance, whilst Sarah's anxiety escalated into near panic. Jenna, ever the researcher, urged calm and methodical investigation, but even she couldn't hide the tremor in her voice when describing the strange occurrences. Then, the unthinkable happened. In the dead of night, as a violent storm raged outside, the entity made its move. I awoke to the sound of shattering glass and the guttural roar of something inhuman. Rushing out of the RV, I found chaos. The creature, a grotesque amalgam of human and beast, was clawing at the side of the vehicle. Its eyes burned with an unnatural ferocity, and its form seemed to ripple in and out of focus, as if reality itself struggled to contain it. "Marcus, get inside!" Sarah screamed, her voice trembling with terror as she huddled behind a collapsed table. Travis was already trying to arm himself with a heavy metal rod, while Jenna scrambled for any relic or talisman she could remember from her research. I grabbed a makeshift spear from our emergency kit. Every muscle tensed with adrenaline. The creature attacked with a savagery that defied human logic. It was not simply lingering or observing, it was violent, relentless. Its claws tore through metal and flesh alike, and every time we struck, it seemed to heal almost instantly, its form shifting in response to our blows. In that moment, I knew that the cursed shaman's spirit was not merely a myth. It was a living, breathing nightmare determined to exact vengeance on those who dared trespass. In the ensuing melee, chaos reigned. I remember the sickening thud as Travis was thrown against the RV wall, a horrid crack resonating as his head hit the metal. Time slowed as I watched him slump to the ground, lifeless. The loss hit us like a physical blow. Travis had been our spark, our wild card, and now he lay motionless, a grim casualty of forces beyond our control. Grief and terror coalesced into a desperate need to escape. Jenna, her voice steady despite the chaos, recalled the journal's mention of a ritual, a desperate measure to appease the vengeful spirit. "We need to perform the ritual as described," she urged, her eyes darting between us. "It might be our only chance to force it to retreat." I nodded, steeling myself for the unknown. With trembling hands, we gathered the symbolic items Jenna had pieced together from her research. A small, hand-carved talisman she'd found near the altar, a handful of herbs native to the region, and a scrap of cloth rumored to have belonged to the shaman himself. The RV, battered and bleeding under the creature's assault, was our only shelter. We retreated inside, barricading the door with whatever we could find. The creature's attacks did not cease immediately. Its violent roars and pounding on the RV's walls rattled us as the storm outside howled in unison. I took a moment to catch my breath, the weight of our situation pressing down on me. I was responsible for my friends, and now, with Travis gone and the creature circling our fragile haven, every decision felt like a matter of life and death. In the tense silence that followed, Sarah's voice cut through the darkness. "Marcus, do you think this ritual will work?" she asked, her words barely audible over the cacophony of rain and the creature's distant shrieks. "I don't know," I replied honestly, my voice rough with fear and exhaustion, "but it's our best shot." Jenna began reciting the ritual's incantations, her voice steady and authoritative despite the chaos. As she spoke, I arranged the symbolic items in a makeshift circle in the center of the RV's living area. The air grew heavy, almost suffused with an otherworldly energy that made my skin crawl. Moments later, the creature's howls grew louder, its presence pressing in on us from every shadow. The very walls of the RV seemed to tremble, as if in anticipation of the ritual's climax. Jenna's chant reached a crescendo, and with a final desperate command, I thrust the talisman into the circle. A blinding flash of light burst forth, and for a heartbeat everything was suspended in an agonizing stillness. When my vision cleared, the creature was gone. The oppressive atmosphere had lifted, replaced by an eerie calm. The storm outside had abated, leaving a haunting silence in its wake. But the cost was unmistakable. Our friend Travis was lost, and the scars of this night would forever haunt us. In the days that followed, we remained in the RV, too terrified to leave the perimeter of what we now called our temporary refuge. The forest around us gradually returned to its deceptive tranquility, but every rustle of leaves or distant howl served as a reminder of the horror we'd endured. Jenna, ever diligent, documented every detail of our encounter in hopes that our experience might serve as a warning to others. Sarah and I found solace in quiet moments, sharing memories of Travis and the strength we'd discovered within ourselves during those dark hours. As I write these words now, safely ensconced far from the cursed edges of Cuyahoga Valley, I can still feel the weight of that night. The cursed spirit, the violent, shape-shifting entity, had been forced into retreat by our desperate act, but I have no doubt that its vengeful presence lingers in those ancient woods. The balance between the natural and the supernatural is fragile, and our intrusion, however unintentional, had upset that equilibrium. I carry with me the lessons of that harrowing weekend. The importance of respecting the old legends and the unseen forces that guard sacred places, and the truth that survival sometimes demands sacrifices that scar both body and soul. I'll never forget the sound of Travis's laughter, now silenced forever by the darkness we encountered. Nor will I ever forget the chilling whisper of the wind that carried the echoes of a cursed past. This experience has left me forever changed. My name is Marcus Reed. I'm 34 years old, and I've learned that sometimes, when you venture too far into the unknown, you awaken forces that can never truly be laid to rest. My name is Claire Monroe. I'm 29 years old, and this happened last October when I decided to escape the pain of a broken relationship and the suffocating pressures of my career. I rented an old RV and headed to Hocking Hills State Park in Ohio, hoping that the isolation and the breathtaking beauty of the woods would help me find some peace, and maybe even inspire my art. I arrived at the park on a chilly Friday afternoon, the sky a haze of fading blues and grays as the sun began its descent. The RV, a battered relic with more miles on it than I cared to count, creaked and groaned with every turn. I wasn't overly concerned. I was here to leave my worries behind. I set up camp in a secluded clearing far from the well-trodden trails. My plan was simple: spend a few days immersed in nature, journal my thoughts, and let the quiet mend my frayed spirit. That first evening, as I sat by a small crackling fire outside the RV, I couldn't help but notice an unnatural mist beginning to form in the distance. It crept slowly, almost deliberately, through the trees. I tried to focus on the dancing flames and the soft sounds of nature, but soon I began to hear faint, disembodied whispers riding the breeze, words I couldn't quite decipher, as if the fog itself was speaking secrets long forgotten. At first, I dismissed the whispers as tricks of the wind, a product of my own loneliness. But as night deepened, the voices grew more insistent, echoing around me with an eerie familiarity. I tried to shake the feeling of unease, telling myself it was nothing more than the isolation playing tricks on my mind. Yet sleep eluded me, and the whispers haunted my every thought. The next morning, determined to dispel my growing anxiety, I ventured out for a walk with my journal and sketchpad in hand. The fog had lifted slightly, leaving behind a damp chill in the air. While wandering along a narrow, overgrown path, I stumbled upon something that made my blood run cold. On the trunk of an ancient oak were carved strange symbols, circular and intricate, as if etched by a practiced hand. I recalled a snippet of local lore I'd read in a travel guide. Legends of protective sigils used by those who worshipped a mysterious force hidden deep within these woods. I snapped a few photos and jotted down notes, my mind racing with both creative inspiration and a nagging dread. I returned to my RV, the images of those eerie carvings lingering in my thoughts. Over a hastily prepared cup of lukewarm coffee, I tried to analyze the inexplicable chill that now seemed woven into the fabric of the forest. My RV's heating system, already temperamental, sputtered and failed as if protesting the encroaching cold. With outdated navigation equipment that now seemed woefully inadequate, I began to worry that I was more isolated than I had ever intended. That night, the mist returned, thicker and more oppressive than before. As darkness blanketed the woods, I found myself awake again, plagued by the persistent whispers. This time, the voices were not merely a background murmur. They carried an urgency, a desperate tone that sent shivers down my spine. I sat huddled on the floor of the RV, the silence outside punctuated by the rhythmic drip of condensation and the distant rustle of leaves. Somewhere, beyond the thin walls of my temporary sanctuary, the whispers shifted and swirled, as though coaxing me deeper into the forest. Unable to resist my curiosity, and perhaps driven by the need for answers, I decided to investigate further the following morning. With a small backpack containing my sketchpad, a few pens, and my ever-present journal, I set out on foot into the depths of Hocking Hills. The path was barely visible, overgrown and winding unpredictably. My outdated GPS had already steered me off the main trail, and I now relied solely on instinct and the dim light of an autumn sun. After about an hour of trekking, the forest opened up to reveal an abandoned cabin hidden behind a curtain of ivy and wild vines. Its wooden structure was weathered, and the windows were shattered, but there was an unmistakable aura of history about it. I felt an inexplicable pull to explore, as if the cabin itself held secrets that resonated with my own internal turmoil. Inside, the air was thick with dust and the scent of decay, yet remnants of a past life lingered in faded photographs and brittle journals scattered on a rickety table. I carefully leafed through one of the journals and discovered entries that spoke of a witches' coven that once gathered in these woods. The writings described a ritual designed to bind a powerful, malevolent spirit known as the Veiled One, a spectral hag who had been both revered and reviled. According to the journal, the witch's hag had been condemned for her cruelty and for summoning dark forces, and her vengeful spirit was said to linger long after her death, forever bound to the land by the very ritual meant to contain her. My heart pounded as I read the entries aloud to myself in the quiet gloom of the cabin. The descriptions of the ritual were vivid. A tarnished locket, a faded piece of cloth, and a concoction of herbs that, when combined, were meant to pacify the spirit and send her back to the netherworld from which she came. I felt a sudden kinship with the woman who had once dared to confront forces far beyond her control, and a deep-seated dread at the possibility that I might have unwittingly awakened something that should have remained buried. I spent the rest of the day carefully examining the cabin and its surroundings, sketching the symbols and relics I found, my mind racing with conflicting emotions. Part of me craved the closure that might come from understanding these ancient rites, while another part warned me that meddling with such dark forces could have dire consequences. Yet, as twilight fell, the mist began to roll in once more, thicker and more malevolent than ever. That night, back in my RV, the boundaries between reality and illusion started to blur. The fog pressed against the windows, and the whispers returned with a ferocity that bordered on desperation. In the dim light of a flickering lantern, I scribbled frantic notes in my journal, trying to piece together the fragmented memories of the cabin and the ominous warnings of the past. The silence was shattered by sudden, disjointed voices, whispers that sounded like echoes of past regrets and unfinished business. I began to sense that the spirit of the Veiled One was not merely an echo of old folklore, but a living presence, manipulating the very atmosphere around me. Shadows danced in the corners of my vision, and for fleeting moments I caught sight of a gaunt, spectral figure lurking in the periphery of the RV's small window, a figure draped in tattered, dark cloth, her face obscured by a veil of mist. My pulse raced, and despite my efforts to steady myself, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that I was not alone. As the night deepened, so did my terror. I heard a low, guttural laugh that seemed to emanate from the very walls of the RV, a sound that was both mocking and sorrowful. I huddled under a threadbare blanket, every muscle tense, as the voices swirled around me in an indecipherable chorus. The moment stretched interminably until, finally, exhaustion pulled me into a restless, haunted sleep. I awoke before dawn, drenched in sweat and trembling. The RV was silent, but the oppressive weight of the night's events lingered in the air. Determined to confront my fear head-on, I gathered the relics I had meticulously noted from the cabin. The tarnished locket I had found on a shelf, a scrap of faded cloth snagged on a broken beam, and a small bundle of herbs I'd salvaged from an old, crumbling trunk. My hands shook as I arranged them on a makeshift altar in the center of the RV's living area. Recalling the journal's instructions with mounting urgency, I began to recite the incantations described within its yellowed pages. My voice was soft at first, barely audible over the persistent whisper of the wind outside. But as I continued, the words seemed to infuse the room with a tangible energy, an almost electric charge that set my skin on edge. The mist outside thickened once again, pressing against the windows as if trying to seep inside, and the whispers grew louder, more insistent, almost pleading. Then, in a moment that felt suspended between reality and nightmare, the temperature in the RV plummeted. A piercing scream, human yet not, ripped through the silence. I could no longer distinguish between the sound of my own racing heartbeat and the cacophony of spectral wails that filled the room. In the midst of this chaos, the figure materialized before my eyes. The Veiled One herself, a ghastly apparition whose eyes glowed with an otherworldly light. Her tattered robes fluttered as if caught in a phantom breeze, and her voice, low and sorrowful, echoed in the confined space. "You dare disturb my eternal slumber," she hissed, her tone a mixture of grief and malice. The sound sent shivers coursing through me, and I struggled to steady my trembling voice. I'm sorry," I stammered. "I only wanted to understand, to find peace." Her laugh, brittle and mocking, filled the room. "Peace?" she repeated, as if the word was foreign to her. "There is no peace for those who meddle in the affairs of the damned." The air around me crackled with an almost tangible hostility as she advanced, her form shifting and blurring, as though struggling to maintain coherence in this world. My mind raced as I fumbled for the relics on the makeshift altar. Remembering the journal's instructions, I raised the tarnished locket in trembling hands and repeated the incantation with renewed determination. The Veiled One recoiled as if struck, and for a brief, agonizing moment, the room was filled with a blinding flash of light. The spectral figure shrieked, a sound of pure anguish that rattled the very foundations of the RV. And then, as abruptly as she had appeared, she began to fade, dissolving into the swirling mists that filled the space. For several long minutes, I stood frozen, every nerve in my body alight with fear and adrenaline. Slowly, the oppressive chill began to lift, and the fog outside receded, leaving behind a haunting calm. I collapsed onto the floor, my vision swimming, my heart pounding as if it might burst from my chest. I had faced the spirit of a tortured past, a past that had haunted these woods for centuries, and in doing so, I had opened a door to a realm I was barely prepared to comprehend. In the aftermath, as dawn crept through the cracks in the RV's weathered walls, I gathered what strength remained and began to document every detail of my ordeal. I scribbled frantic notes in my journal and sketched the fleeting image of the spectral hag, determined that my experience would serve as both a catharsis and a warning to any who might follow in my footsteps. I spent the rest of that day in a state of numbed disbelief. The events of the night etched permanently into my memory. The woods around the RV seemed unchanged, majestic, silent witnesses to centuries of secrets. But I could no longer see them as mere nature. They were the guardians of ancient rites and sorrowful memories, and I had become entangled in their endless spectral dance. In the days that followed, I repaired what little damage the encounter had wrought on my RV, and gradually resumed my routine, though I was never quite the same. The lingering presence of the Veiled One was a constant reminder that some forces, no matter how deeply buried, can always find a way to resurface. I eventually left Hocking Hills with more questions than answers, but also with a newfound resolve to confront my inner demons and to channel the raw intensity of that experience into my art. I now spend long nights in my studio, painting the swirling mists and shadowy figures that haunted those fateful days. My work is raw, visceral, a testament to the nights I spent shivering under a threadbare blanket, listening to the voices of the forgotten. I share my story in hushed tones with those who show genuine curiosity, hoping that my words might serve as a warning that the woods hold more than just beauty, and that some spirits, like the Veiled One, are never truly laid to rest. My name is Claire Monroe. I'm 29 years old, and I learned that healing sometimes comes at a price. The solitude I sought in Hocking Hills became both a refuge and a crucible, a place where I was forced to face the darkest corners of my past and the spectral remnants of a bygone era. Even now, as I put the finishing touches on my latest piece, a swirling, enigmatic portrait of a veiled figure, I can't help but wonder if somewhere in the depths of those ancient woods, the whispers in the fog continue their eternal lament, waiting for the next weary soul to wander too far into their midst. My name is Karen Thompson, and I am 42 years old. This all happened last October when my family and I decided to take an RV trip into the depths of Zaleski State Forest in southeastern Ohio, a desperate attempt to heal old wounds and reconnect after too many years of silent grief and mounting tension. Our aging RV, a battered relic we'd clung to for the promise of freedom and adventure, rumbled along the winding forest roads. My husband Mark was at the wheel. Ever the adventurer, Mark had always been impulsive, charging headfirst into any challenge with reckless optimism. I, on the other hand, was the planner, the cautious soul trying to keep us safe. Our teenage daughter, Ellie, was seated in the back, earbuds in, her eyes shining with a rebellious curiosity. Little Jake, only 10, sat quietly in the front, his wide eyes taking in every twist of the scenery as if absorbing some secret language of the wild. We had chosen Zaleski State Forest deliberately. I had spent weeks poring over local legends, convinced that the ancient folklore of the region, a murky mix of indigenous rituals and dark superstitions, held echoes of warning that we could perhaps ignore on a sunny day. But that optimism was to be short-lived. The journey started with promise. We arrived at a small clearing on the outskirts of the forest, the autumn air crisp and brimming with the scent of pine and damp earth. I set about preparing our temporary campsite while Mark fiddled with the RV's unreliable engine, a creaky contraption that seemed as tired as we were. Despite our excitement, a sense of isolation gnawed at me. The forest was beautiful, yet intimidating, its ancient trees whispering secrets on the wind. That first evening, as dusk draped its velvet cloak over the clearing, I gathered the family around a modest fire. I began recounting the local lore, stories of eerie symbols carved into bark, of mysterious figures seen at the edge of vision, and of unsolved disappearances attributed to a forgotten cannibal cult that, according to some accounts, had distorted indigenous rituals into something unspeakably dark. I half smiled at Ellie's skeptical frown and Mark's dismissive laugh. Yet, even as I spoke, I couldn't shake the chill that crept along my spine. It wasn't long before the first signs of something amiss emerged. As we settled in for the night, I stepped outside to check on Jake, who had confided in me earlier about hearing voices in the dark. The silence of the forest was broken by an inexplicable rustling, and when I shone my flashlight across the clearing, I noticed strange tracks circling our RV, huge, oddly human-like footprints intermingled with animal prints. My heart pounded. I remembered the symbols I had seen in old photographs of local legends, primitive, crude etchings that seemed to warn intruders away from sacred ground. I returned inside, unsettled, and tried to dismiss it as my imagination playing tricks on me in the dim light. But the unease persisted, punctuated by the soft, mournful whispering that Jake later described in tearful whispers, voices that seemed to be calling out from the depths of the forest. The following day, tensions among us began to fray. Mark's frustration with the failing RV grew as he attempted to patch up the engine, insisting we press on despite the ominous signs. Ellie, eager to prove her independence and dismissive of our fears, snuck out with her phone in hand to explore the surrounding woods. I warned her repeatedly, but the allure of unraveling the mystery was too strong for her teenage bravado. Meanwhile, Jake grew increasingly withdrawn, his eyes haunted by something unseen. Every creak of the RV and every whisper of wind set him trembling. That afternoon, while I was checking our supplies, I discovered more disturbing evidence. Carved symbols on a nearby tree that matched those from the legends I'd researched. They were crudely etched and seemed to pulse in the shifting light. I traced my fingers along the rough bark, feeling as if I were touching a scar on the land itself. Fear seeped into my bones. As dusk fell that evening, the forest transformed into a realm of eerie shadows and silent threats. I decided to search for Ellie, who had not returned from her exploration. Mark and I ventured into the forest, calling her name, our voices swallowed by the oppressive silence. The path was overgrown and unfamiliar, and as we walked, the air grew unnaturally cold, as if a presence had snuffed out the warmth of the day. After what felt like hours, we found her near a cluster of ancient trees. She stood transfixed, her eyes fixed on a silhouette in the distance. A figure cloaked in tattered traditional garb, barely visible against the darkening sky. I reached out to her, and she startled, murmuring that the figure had disappeared like smoke. Mark's brow furrowed as he tried to console her, but I could see the terror in her eyes. We hurried back to the RV, but the unsettling feeling that we were being watched clung to us like a shroud. Night descended fully, and with it came a relentless barrage of eerie phenomena. Jake, who had fallen asleep, woke with a start, crying out about ghostly voices and the sound of rhythmic drumming, a primitive, unyielding beat that seemed to echo the very pulse of the forest. I sat by his bed in the cramped confines of the RV, stroking his hair and promising that everything would be all right, though my own heart raced with uncertainty. In the dead of night, a violent storm broke over us, plunging the forest into a chaos of wind and rain. The RV's old wiring sparked and fizzled, leaving us in near total darkness. With no working lights and a sense of dread mounting, I gathered flashlights and batteries, urging everyone to stay close. Mark attempted to fix the wiring, his tools clanking in the oppressive silence, while I huddled with Jake and Ellie trying to keep calm. Then, amid the storm, we heard it. A distant, guttural chant, carried by the wind. It wasn't just any chant. It was a ritualistic call that sent shivers down my spine. I recalled the local legends of a cannibal cult that had once roamed these parts. Twisted remnants of indigenous practices transformed into acts of barbarity. The sound was chillingly rhythmic, echoing through the trees like the beating of a drum of doom. We locked ourselves inside the RV, our sanctuary now feeling like a fragile barrier against an unseen menace. My hands trembled as I tried to call for help on a nearly dead cell phone, but there was no signal in the middle of nowhere. Outside, the storm raged on, and the chanting grew louder, closer. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were surrounded, that the cult members were closing in, their intentions both brutal and ritualistic. At some point, Mark decided that our only hope was to leave immediately. Despite my protests, urging caution and the need to understand what we were facing, Mark's impulsive nature took over. We bundled our belongings and made a break for the RV, hoping to drive out of the forest as the storm raged. The darkness and the lashing rain turned the forest into a labyrinth of shadows. Every flash of lightning revealed fleeting shapes in the distance. Human-like figures, their forms blurred and indistinct, as if seen through a veil of supernatural distortion. Then came the moment that shattered our tenuous hope of escape. The RV's engine, already on the brink, sputtered and died just as we reached a narrow, overgrown road. We were stranded. Mark's face went pale as he tried to restart the engine, his frustration mounting with each failed attempt. I could see that something wasn't right. There was an almost palpable sense of malevolence in the air. And then, amidst the howling wind, I heard footsteps. Not one set, but several, moving methodically toward us. I peered through a small window and saw them. Figures in dark, ragged clothing, faces obscured by hoods and masks. They moved with an unnatural coordination, their eyes glinting with a cold, predatory light. I recognized the signs of the ancient cannibal cult. The twisted descendants of indigenous rituals turned sinister, now evolved into a secretive band of savages. Their approach was deliberate and violent. They were not mere ghosts haunting the woods. They were flesh and blood, with an appetite for terror and perhaps even our flesh. Mark barricaded the door while I gathered what makeshift weapons we could find. An old camping knife, a length of metal pipe, anything to defend ourselves. Ellie, though shaken, clutched her phone, determined to document everything as if recording proof would somehow ward off the evil. Jake huddled in the corner, eyes wide and filled with unspeakable fear. The first attack came swiftly. One of the cult members smashed the RV's side window with a heavy rock, the sound of shattering glass mingling with the storm's fury. Mark and I exchanged a panicked look. This was no longer a matter of caution, but of survival. The intruders were not content with merely encircling us. they intended to break in and complete their grisly ritual. The chanting resumed, louder now, almost hypnotic in its intensity. I took a deep breath, remembering the local lore and the ancient symbols I'd seen on the trees. Somewhere in my research, I had come across references to protective rituals, old prayers and counter-rituals that were said to repel evil spirits and cursed beings. I fumbled through my backpack for a small notebook where I had jotted down scraps of this lore. The words were archaic, barely decipherable, but they were our only hope. As the first intruder forced his way through the broken window, Mark and I fought with desperate determination. I managed to plunge the camping knife into his arm as he lunged at me, while Mark swung the metal pipe with all his strength, sending him reeling back. In that moment, I realized that every decision we had made, the impulsiveness, the skepticism, had led us to this point of mortal peril. The cult members were ruthless, and they fought not only with physical savagery but with the dark power of ancient curses that seemed to swirl around them like a tangible force. Outside, the storm raged and the chants grew ever more frenzied. The figures moved with supernatural speed and coordinated brutality, their eyes burning with a fanatic intensity. It became clear that the cult's presence was not just symbolic, it was a living, breathing manifestation of ancient evil, one that relished violence and death. In the midst of the chaos, Ellie's phone buzzed. I caught a glimpse of her determined face as she recorded every horrifying detail. Somehow, I knew that even if we didn't survive, her account might be the one piece of evidence that could expose the darkness lurking in these woods. Meanwhile, Jake's quiet whimpers of terror underscored the fact that innocence was being torn apart in the face of unspeakable horror. Time lost all meaning as we fought for every breath, every heartbeat. The RV, once our safe haven, was now a claustrophobic trap. In one heart-stopping moment, Mark managed to force open the door of the RV, and we scrambled out into the torrential rain. The forest was a blur of shadows and rain, and every step felt like a march into the unknown. We ran, stumbling over tangled roots and slick leaves, with the echo of pursuit close behind. I kept reciting the protective words I had memorized, each syllable a desperate plea against the malevolent forces that closed in on us. The forest, normally a place of natural beauty, had transformed into a hellish arena where ancient evil and modern terror collided. Behind us, the rhythmic drumming and chanting reached a fever pitch, and I could almost feel the presence of those cursed souls, reaching out with cold, unyielding hands. It wasn't long before we reached a narrow clearing where a broken trail lay hidden beneath the gnarled branches. Exhausted and battered, we paused to catch our breath, knowing that the cult was still on our trail. I looked at my family. Mark, his face streaked with rain and blood, Ellie with tears and determination, and little Jake clinging to my hand in silent terror. In that fleeting moment, the weight of our shared loss and desperation bonded us together, even as the supernatural threat loomed large. I made a decision then. If we were to survive, we had to confront the darkness head-on. I recalled an old passage from my notebook about how the symbols etched into the trees could serve as a protective barrier if invoked correctly. In the center of the clearing stood a massive oak, its trunk covered in the same primitive etchings I had seen earlier. With trembling hands and a racing heart, I approached the tree and began to recite the archaic verses, my voice rising above the din of the storm and the distant chanting. It was a prayer, not just of protection, but of defiance, a declaration that we would not surrender to the encroaching darkness. For a moment, time seemed to still. The chanting faltered, and the figures in the distance hesitated as if caught in a trance. I felt a surge of hope mixed with terror. Perhaps the ancient words carried the power to ward off the malevolent force that had stalked us. But the reprieve was short-lived. With a shriek that pierced the night, The cult members surged forward once more, their eyes burning with fanaticism. Mark, Ellie, and I clung together as we prepared to fight one final time. The cult members, now almost spectral in their ferocity, descended upon us with a fury that defied human reason. I fought with every ounce of strength, my knife flashing in the pale light, while Mark swung his pipe with a desperate determination. Ellie, though young and scared, stood her ground, her phone still recording as if it were a talisman against the dark. In that brutal melee, our world narrowed down to the primal urge to survive. The rain, the wind, the chants, and the staccato rhythm of violence merged into a single, overwhelming moment of terror and hope. And then, amid the chaos, a sudden calm descended. The cult members, as if sensing that their ritual had reached its climax, retreated into the shadows, leaving us battered, bleeding, and trembling in the rain. We huddled together in the clearing as dawn's first light broke over the horizon, revealing the devastation around us. Our once promising RV lay abandoned, a broken monument to our failed escape. In the aftermath, we counted our losses. Mark's arm was injured badly, and though Ellie and Jake had escaped physical harm, the emotional scars would take far longer to heal. I knew that at least one life was lost that night, a sacrifice demanded by the darkness we had unwittingly disturbed. In the days that followed, we were rescued by local authorities who had been alerted by neighbors and hikers. Their skepticism of our story did little to soothe the raw terror we'd experienced. Even now, as I sit in the relative safety of our home, the memory of that night is etched into every shadow, every whisper of wind. I have nightmares of the chanting, the drumming, and those ghostly eyes that burned with unholy fire. I recorded our ordeal in painstaking detail, not just as a record of survival, but as a warning. The ancient evil that lurks in Zaleski State Forest is not a myth to be scoffed at. It is a living, violent force. A remnant of twisted indigenous rituals and cannibalistic fanaticism that remains dormant until provoked by the intrusion of outsiders. I have come to believe that the forest itself remembers, and it calls to those who dare disturb its cursed secrets. Today, my family and I live with the scars of that night, both visible and unseen. Mark is still recovering from his injuries. Ellie's once carefree spirit is now tempered by an acute awareness of the darkness in the world, and little Jake, who once marveled at fairy tales, now sleeps with one eye open. But amid our pain, there is also a fragile hope that our experience might serve as a beacon for others, a reminder that sometimes the legends are real, and survival in isolation demands that we confront not only the darkness outside, but the shadows within ourselves. As I write this, I cannot help but wonder, did we truly repel the ancient evil, or was it merely biding its time in the hidden recesses of the forest, waiting for another chance to strike? The questions linger like the morning mist over Zaleski State Forest, a reminder that the boundary between the known and the unknown is as thin as the autumn air, and that sometimes the past is never truly buried. I share this story not for sympathy, but as a testament to the resilience of the human spirit in the face of unspeakable horror. A reminder that even in the darkest of nights, when the world seems to conspire against you, hope can still be found in the bonds of family and the strength of a determined heart. My name is Karen Thompson, and I survived a night of unimaginable terror in the depths of Ohio's wilderness. I tell this tale as both a warning and a tribute to the fallen, to the brave, and to the eternal struggle against the darkness that lingers in the shadows of our world. My name is Jack Bennett, and I am 38 years old. This happened last November, when I decided to leave behind the suffocating memories of my past and seek solace in the remote stretches of Wayne National Forest in Ohio. I had traded the relentless clamor of the city for an old RV, a creaking, unreliable refuge that promised both escape and confrontation with the wild, as well as with the demons I carried inside. I had been running for years, trying to bury the guilt and regrets that haunted me like shadows. The idea of a solo camping trip in the heart of the forest was both an act of penance and a desperate bid for redemption. I imagined that, in the silence of nature and the isolation of endless autumn nights, I might finally come to terms with the mistakes that had shattered my life. The journey began with a long, winding drive on deserted roads. My RV, battered by time and neglect, rattled along as the golden leaves of late autumn danced past the windows. The chill in the air seeped through the thin walls of the vehicle, and soon I found myself wrestling with a failing heater and a sputtering generator. I made a mental note that I'd have to scavenge for extra blankets and a more reliable power source once I reached my chosen spot, a remote clearing off an abandoned logging road deep within Wayne National Forest. When I finally parked the RV in that desolate clearing, the landscape took my breath away. Towering pines and gnarled hardwoods stood like silent sentinels against a sky the color of cold steel. The ground was carpeted with fallen leaves and brittle twigs, and the forest exhaled a quiet, almost mournful sigh as the wind rustled through its limbs. For a moment, I felt a tentative peace settle over me, as if the forest itself was offering a reprieve from the constant internal turmoil. My first few days were a fragile balance of hope and apprehension. I set up my meager campsite around the RV and tried to fix the small faults that threatened to undermine my isolation. I scavenged for firewood, rigged up a makeshift heating system, and recorded my thoughts in a battered journal. But as the days grew colder and the nights longer, I began to notice unsettling signs that my solitude might not be as undisturbed as I had believed. It started with inexplicable footprints around the RV. I discovered them early one morning as I was collecting firewood, massive, elongated imprints that seemed too large for any animal native to these parts. They circled the RV, disappearing into the underbrush as if deliberately marking my presence. Alongside these tracks, I found crude symbols carved into the bark of a nearby tree. The markings were primitive runes, dark and deliberate, evoking a sense of ancient curses and forgotten rituals. I brushed them off at first, attributing them to vandals or the lingering scars of history. But deep down, a nagging unease began to root itself in my mind. That night, as I lay in the cramped confines of the RV, the wind howled like a chorus of distant voices. I could swear I heard faint whispers, half-formed words carried on the breeze, as if the forest was trying to speak to me. The generator's sporadic hum did little to banish the oppressive silence that seemed to press in from every side. Sleep was elusive, replaced by fitful moments of paranoia, where every creak of the RV and every rustle of leaves sent my heart pounding. In the depths of one particularly cold, sleepless night, I awoke to the sound of snapping twigs just beyond the window. I pulled the curtain aside and strained my eyes against the dark. For a fleeting moment, I thought I saw a shadow moving between the trees, a tall, gaunt figure with unnaturally elongated limbs. I blinked, and the vision was gone, swallowed by the blackness. I tried to convince myself it was a trick of the light, a product of my exhausted mind. But a cold dread settled in my gut, a primal warning that something was not right. Days passed in a tense limbo of isolation and dread. The forest, once a silent haven, now seemed to watch me with unseen eyes. I ventured out during daylight to scavenge for supplies and to explore the area, determined to convince myself that the eerie occurrences were mere coincidences. On one such outing, while trudging through a carpet of brittle leaves, I discovered another disturbing clue. a scrap of cloth, torn and frayed, caught on a snag of metal. It bore a peculiar insignia, one that matched the runes I had seen etched on the trees near my RV. At first, I told myself it was left behind by a hiker or some long-forgotten wanderer. But as the days grew darker and the presence I sensed became more tangible, I began to recall the old local legends I had read about. The stories spoke of a curse born of greed and betrayal, a curse that transformed humans into monstrous beings, driven by an insatiable hunger. They called it the wendigo. According to these tales, those touched by the curse were doomed to wander the forest, their humanity stripped away, leaving only a hollow, ravenous creature in its place. I had never believed in such things. Until now, the signs were too consistent, too deliberate. The footprints, the carvings, the torn cloth, they all pointed to something not entirely of this world. And then came the dreams. That first night, as I huddled beneath a thin blanket, I was haunted by visions of a gaunt figure with sunken eyes and a hunger that seemed to devour not just flesh, but the very essence of life. I awoke in a cold sweat, my heart hammering against my ribs, feeling as though I had come perilously close to an unspeakable truth. One starless night, the forest revealed its terror with brutal clarity. I had been out foraging near the edge of the clearing when I heard it, a sound so chilling and deliberate that it froze the blood in my veins. It was a low, guttural growl, followed by the rustle of leaves and the unmistakable sound of footsteps crunching on dead branches. I retreated as quickly as my trembling legs would carry me, the fading light of dusk surrendering to the inky blackness of the night. Huddled inside the RV, I fumbled for the flare gun I kept for emergencies. The small metal cylinder felt both feeble and desperate in my shaking hand. I lit the flare, and its burning glow threw frantic shadows on the walls. Outside, I caught sight of movement, quick, fleeting, and impossibly silent. For a moment, I thought I saw the gaunt silhouette of the wendigo, its elongated limbs and hollow eyes glaring back at me before it melted into the darkness. I could no longer deny the possibility that this creature was stalking me, its presence an ever-tightening noose around my already fragile sanity. As the nights passed, the terror escalated. My RV's generator continued to fail intermittently, plunging me into oppressive darkness punctuated by the storm's howls and the creature's unseen steps. I was forced to leave the relative safety of my vehicle one bitter morning when the heater gave out entirely. With nothing but a heavy coat and a dwindling supply of blankets, I set out to search for a more secure shelter. It was then that I stumbled upon an old, abandoned logging cabin hidden among the towering trees. The cabin was decrepit, its wooden walls weathered and rotted by years of neglect. It exuded an aura of melancholy and despair, as if it had borne witness to countless tragedies. Inside, I found remnants of lives long past, dusty journals, faded photographs, and scattered mementos that hinted at a history of fear and loss. Among the brittle pages of one journal, I discovered detailed entries about a curse that transformed desperate souls into creatures of endless hunger. The writer spoke of ancient runes and protective rituals meant to ward off the darkness, though their words were filled with regret and resignation. I felt as if I had stumbled upon the lost fragments of a forgotten history, a history that now ensnared me in its grim embrace. With the cabin as my temporary refuge, I resolved to confront the horrors that plagued me. I pored over the journals, trying to decipher the archaic verses that promised protection against the cursed beings. The more I read, the more I realized that the legends were not mere superstition. They were warnings etched into the very fabric of this land. The runes I had seen near my RV were not random acts of vandalism. They were remnants of a ritual, a desperate attempt to keep the wendigo at bay. It was on one bone-chilling night that the final confrontation arrived. I had taken a risk and ventured out into the forest once more, determined to scavenge for supplies and perhaps a clue to end this nightmare. The wind whipped around me, carrying with it the familiar haunting whispers of the forest. I could feel the presence of something malevolent watching me from the shadows, its gaze as cold and unyielding as the winter that was fast approaching. Suddenly, out of the darkness, emerged the wendigo. It was more terrifying than any of my dreams, a gaunt, emaciated horror with eyes that glowed with an unholy hunger. Its limbs moved with an eerie, unnatural grace as it stalked me silently, each step measured and deliberate. I froze, the flare gun clutched in my trembling hand, as the creature advanced with a predatory focus that left no doubt of its lethal intent. Panic surged through me, and I fired the flare gun. The burst of light illuminated the creature in ghastly detail, the hollow eyes, the twisted, angular features, the unmistakable aura of ancient evil. For a brief moment, the wendigo recoiled, as if the light itself was an affront to its existence. Seizing that moment of hesitation, I scrambled backwards, my heart pounding so violently I was sure it would burst from my chest. But the respite was short-lived. The creature regained its composure, its hunger now a palpable force as it lunged forward with supernatural speed. I managed to dodge its snapping claws, the ragged sound of its approach mingling with my own desperate gasps for air. Every instinct screamed at me to run, yet I found myself rooted to the spot, torn between terror and a resolve born of too many years of running. Desperation lent me strength. I remembered the protective verses from the cabin's journal, the ancient words meant to repel the curse. With shaking lips and a racing mind, I began to recite them, my voice barely audible over the howling wind. The words, archaic and laden with meaning, seemed to hang in this air, as if the forest itself was pausing to listen. I felt an unexpected surge of power, as though the act of speaking those words was forging a shield around me. For a heartbeat, the wendigo hesitated. Its eyes flickered with a strange, almost pained recognition, and it halted as if caught in the grip of an internal battle. I continued the incantation, each syllable a plea for deliverance, each verse a desperate command for the ancient curse to relent. The creature snarled, its sound a guttural blend of rage and hunger, and then, as if the power of the words had pierced its very essence, it recoiled and staggered back into the darkness. I stood there, chest heaving, the forest around me eerily silent once more. The brief moment of reprieve left me trembling with a mix of relief and lingering dread. I knew that this was not the end. The wendigo, or whatever darkness it represented, was a part of this cursed land, and my escape would not be so easily won. But in that moment, I had won a small victory, one that bolstered my resolve to survive. In the days that followed, I fortified my makeshift camp near the logging cabin. I gathered what supplies I could and took every precaution to protect myself, using the protective symbols from the journal to mark a perimeter around my shelter. The forest remained ominously quiet, the sense of being watched ever present. Yet I pressed on, determined to break free from the nightmare that had ensnared me. As dawn broke on one final morning, I made the decision to leave Wayne National Forest behind. I packed my few belongings and, with a heavy heart, climbed back into the RV. The machine, despite its failures, sputtered to life as if it too longed to escape the clutches of the cursed woods. Driving away, I cast a final glance in the rearview mirror. The trees receded into a misty oblivion, their secrets locked away in the silence of the forest. Even now, as I navigate the highways of a world far removed from that haunted place, the memory of those nights remains etched into my soul. I still hear the whispers on cold nights, and I still see in the corners of my vision the fleeting shape of that gaunt figure with hollow eyes. The curse of the wendigo, or perhaps the curse within myself, lingers like an old wound, one that may never truly heal. I carry with me the lesson that sometimes the most dangerous battles are fought not against external monsters, but against the shadows within our own hearts. The isolation of Wayne National Forest forced me to confront my own guilt and regret, to face the hunger for redemption that had driven me to this point. I emerged battered and scarred, but with a new understanding. Survival is not merely about escaping the clutches of physical terror. It is about finding the strength to reckon with the darkness that dwells within. My journey through that cursed forest was a harrowing trial by fire, a test of will against both nature and the supernatural. I may have escaped the immediate threat of the wendigo, but I know that some part of that ancient evil remains with me, a reminder that the past is never easily left behind. And so, with each step I take on the open road, I carry both the burden and the hope of a man who has stared into the abyss and lived to tell the tale. My name is Jack Bennett, and I survived the haunted nights of Wayne National Forest. I share my story as a testament to the fragile line between myth and reality, and as a reminder that sometimes, in the depths of isolation and despair, we find not only our demons, but also the strength to overcome them. My name is Jack Thompson. I'm 34 years old, and this is the story of the nightmare I experienced in Hocking Hills State Park last autumn. A tale of isolation, deteriorating equipment, and a curse that clawed its way out of ancient sorrow. It all began when my friends and I decided to escape the suffocating pressures of our daily lives in Columbus. Sarah Miller, our pragmatic and empathetic de facto leader, had organized the trip with the best intentions. Mike Carter, ever the skeptical thrill-seeker with an impulsive streak, was in for his usual dose of adrenaline. And then there was Lisa Nguyen, quiet and intuitive, whose sensitivity to energies and old lore made her the perfect counterbalance to Mike's dismissiveness. We pooled our savings and rented an old RV, lured by the promise of reconnecting with nature and healing our fractured friendships. We set off on a brisk October morning, the autumn air biting at our cheeks as we navigated winding roads toward Hocking Hills. The RV itself was a relic. Its engine coughed and sputtered, the heater barely managing to fend off the chill, and the interior lights flickered ominously when we hit bumps on the road. Yet we pressed on, convinced that our adventure would be an escape from our problems, if only for a little while. Our arrival at Hocking Hills was breathtaking. The landscape was a tapestry of vibrant reds, oranges, and yellows, interwoven with ancient trees and craggy rock formations. As dusk approached on our first day, we parked the RV in a secluded clearing off a poorly marked dirt road. Sarah immediately set about organizing our supplies, while Mike, ever the prankster, joked about the RV's quirks. I, however, couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. That night, as we gathered around a crackling campfire, a strange silence fell over the woods. The usual rustle of nocturnal creatures was replaced by an eerie hush. I remember sitting on the tailgate, nursing a cup of lukewarm coffee, when I noticed something peculiar, a series of primitive carvings on a nearby tree. The markings were not random scrawls, but appeared deliberate, etched deeply into the bark with symbols reminiscent of indigenous art. Lisa leaned in, her eyes wide with recognition and quiet concern. "These are warnings," she murmured. "They say these lands are sacred and that ancient spirits guard them." Mike snorted. "Oh, come on, Lisa, it's just some old carvings. Nothing to worry about." But his tone betrayed a flicker of unease, even as he tried to dismiss the significance of the markings. The unease only deepened when I heard soft, almost imperceptible whispers emanating from the shadows beyond the campfire's glow. I peered into the darkness, straining to catch the source of the sound, but the misty night swallowed any hint of movement. The sensation of being watched crept over me, making my skin crawl. Our first night passed in fitful sleep, punctuated by sporadic power flickers from the RV and unsettling dreams. I awoke around midnight to find the RV's heater had stopped working altogether, plunging us into a frigid silence. I stepped outside to inspect the engine when I saw her, a spectral figure draped in a flowing white dress, standing at the edge of the clearing. Her eyes were filled with sorrow, and as I approached, she vanished like smoke on the wind. I returned inside, heart pounding, unable to tell if my eyes had deceived me. The next morning, our conversations were hushed, the shared look of dread replacing the usual light banter. Lisa, with a trembling voice, explained that the apparition was tied to local lore, a tragic tale of an indigenous healer wronged by settlers whose spirit was doomed to wander these woods in eternal mourning. Sarah, ever the level-headed one, suggested we consult a local historian later that day, but Mike waved off the idea, grumbling that our minds were playing tricks on us. We spent the day hiking through the labyrinthine trails of Hocking Hills. The trails were as treacherous as they were beautiful, with dense foliage and rocky outcroppings that concealed hidden dangers. The further we ventured, the more the atmosphere grew oppressive. Shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally long, and the trees themselves appeared to whisper secrets on the wind. As the dusk fell on the second night, our RV's malfunctioning lights left us in near darkness. We huddled inside, our voices barely audible as we recounted the unsettling events of the past night. It was then that an eerie, unearthly wail tore through the silence, a banshee's cry, or so it seemed. The sound reverberated through the woods, and even Mike, who had been the most vocal skeptic, fell silent in terror. Unable to ignore the mounting evidence that we were not alone, Lisa took it upon herself to research the history of these woods. That night, as I sat by the dim glow of a dying lantern, she shared the story she had uncovered. According to local legend, the spirit of the healer was sacrificed by her own people to appease a vengeful, darker force, a force that, in her weakened state, bound her to the land. The carvings, the whispers, and the apparitions were all manifestations of a curse laid upon these ancient grounds. The spirit was both a warning and a harbinger of impending doom, her sorrow a prelude to violence if the curse was further disturbed. The realization sent a chill deeper than the autumn cold through my bones. That night, while most of us tried to rest, I couldn't shake the feeling of impending danger. In the dead of night, I heard muffled voices outside the RV, an odd mix of whispered incantations and cries of anguish. I crept to the window and caught a glimpse of a figure standing by the tree line, watching us intently. It wasn't the white-dressed apparition, but something else entirely. A gaunt, almost skeletal humanoid figure, its eyes glinting with a predatory hunger. The following morning, with a dread gnawing at us, we decided to seek help. Sarah suggested we visit a small town near the park where a reputed local historian lived, a man known to have an intimate knowledge of the indigenous lore of the region. Reluctantly, we set out, the RV lurching along the bumpy road as if it too were eager to flee. The town was a small weathered settlement with people who eyed us warily. When we mentioned our experiences, their faces hardened and whispers of curses and ancient wrongs passed among them. The historian, an elderly man named Elijah Grant, lived on the outskirts in a dilapidated farmhouse. He welcomed us with a grave nod and listened intently as we recounted our experiences. His lined face grew even more solemn as he revealed the truth. The spirit of the healer was indeed bound by a curse born of betrayal and sacrifice. According to Elijah, the only way to lift the curse was to perform an ancient ritual of appeasement at a natural stone circle deep within the woods, a site believed to be where the original sacrifice took place. Armed with this newfound knowledge, the gravity of our situation sank in. The historian's directions were clear yet foreboding. We must venture into the heart of Hocking Hills at dusk, gather specific relics from the area, a ceremonial bowl carved from oak, a bundle of sacred herbs, and a personal offering of remorse, and recite the long-forgotten incantations that honored the spirit's legacy. That evening, we prepared ourselves for the ritual. Our RV was parked at the edge of a clearing near the stone circle, the air heavy with the scent of decaying leaves and damp earth. The sky, painted with bruised purples and deep blues, bore witness to our trembling resolve. Sarah organized our meager supplies with a steady hand, while Mike muttered under his breath about superstition. I helped Lisa gather the relics we had managed to scrounge up from Elijah's collection. A battered oak bowl and a small pouch of herbs that still smelled of the forest. The personal offering, we decided, would be my own confession of the sins and mistakes that had driven me into isolation. A symbolic act of atonement. As we approached the stone circle, an almost palpable tension filled the air. The circle, a ring of ancient boulders weathered by centuries, radiated a sinister energy. Shadows danced among the stones, and the wind carried faint, mournful cries that seemed to emanate from the earth itself. In the center of the circle, I could almost see the imprint of a presence, watchful, expectant, and painfully sad. We arranged ourselves in a rough circle, the relics placed carefully at the center. Lisa led the incantation, her voice trembling at first but growing more resolute as she recited the ancient words passed down through generations. Sarah's eyes were fixed on the relics, her expression one of solemn determination. Mike, though visibly uneasy, tried to maintain a facade of bravado, while I, the reluctant chronicler of our ordeal, found myself praying silently for deliverance. As Lisa's final words echoed into the night, the temperature plummeted. The ground beneath our feet trembled, and the wind howled as if mourning a long-forgotten grief. Out of the darkness emerged the spectral figure of the healer, her white dress billowing in the wind, her eyes glistening with tears and fury. The spirit floated before us, suspended between realms, a beautiful, tragic vision of lost hope and seething vengeance. For a few agonizing moments, time seemed to stand still. The spirit's gaze swept over us, lingering on each face with an intensity that made my heart feel as though it would burst. Then, in a sudden, violent burst of energy, objects began to fly through the air. The sacred bowl shattered, its fragments scattering across the stone circle. Sarah was thrown back by an invisible force, and Mike's cry of pain was swallowed by the cacophony of the storm. The spirit's wail crescendoed into a deafening roar that reverberated through the forest. It was as if the curse had awoken fully, unleashing its wrath upon us. I scrambled to my feet, my mind racing as I tried to reconcile the ancient lore with the violent reality unfolding before me. Amid the chaos, Lisa's eyes locked onto mine. A silent plea, a message of unity. In that moment, I knew that if we were to survive, we had to confront the curse together. Summoning every ounce of courage, I stepped forward and shouted above the tumult, "We honor you. We acknowledge our wrongs. Please, let us make this right." My voice, though quivering with fear, carried the sincerity of a man desperate for redemption. Sarah, regaining her composure, joined in, echoing my plea with a forceful clarity that resonated with the spirit's sorrow. The air thickened with tension as the spirit's anger began to subside, replaced by a deep, resonant sadness. The wind calmed, and the violent flurry of debris slowly settled. For a long, agonizing moment, the only sound was our ragged breathing. The spectral figure drifted closer, her eyes now filled with a mixture of pain and tentative forgiveness. With a final, sorrowful gaze, she whispered words that I could not quite make out, as if carried on the wind of a different era. Then, as suddenly as she had appeared, the spirit dissipated, leaving behind an oppressive silence and a profound sense of loss. We stood there, battered and shaken, our hearts heavy with the weight of the curse that had nearly consumed us. The ritual had worked, or at least it had calmed the vengeful spirit long enough for us to escape the immediate danger. In the days that followed, we remained in the vicinity of Hocking Hills, too afraid to leave the perimeter of our makeshift camp. The local authorities, when finally alerted to our distress, were baffled by our account of the supernatural events. But for us, the truth was undeniable. The curse had been lifted, though not without its scars. Each of us bore physical and emotional wounds that would serve as permanent reminders of that night. Mike's earlier bravado was replaced by a newfound respect for forces beyond human comprehension. Sarah's steadfast leadership had earned her the unspoken gratitude of the group, though the burden of responsibility weighed heavily on her. Lisa, whose sensitivity to the spiritual had proven both a gift and a curse, remained quietly haunted by the spirit's sorrowful eyes. And I, the reluctant narrator of this ordeal, found that my journey had transformed me in ways I never imagined. I had come seeking escape, only to confront the ancient pain and wrath of a land scarred by history. Even now, as I recount this tale, the chill of that autumn night still clings to me. I have learned that some ancient forces, rooted in the deep wounds of history, are not easily appeased, and that the line between myth and reality is far thinner than we dare to imagine. The healer's spirit remains a silent guardian of Hocking Hills, a reminder that respect for the sacred traditions of the land is not merely superstition, but a necessary homage to those who came before us. My name is Jack Thompson. I'm 34 years old, and I survived the curse of Hocking Shadows. Yet, in every creak of the RV, every whisper in the woods, and every flicker of a dying light, I am reminded of that night when ancient sorrow and human frailty collided in a dance of terror and redemption. And so I continue my journey, forever changed, forever watchful, knowing that the past, with all its mysteries and regrets, still walks among us. My name is Ryan Brooks. I'm 42 years old, and this all happened last autumn, when I decided to leave behind the ghosts of my past and seek refuge in the wild solitude of Cuyahoga Valley National Park. I thought that a solo RV camping trip would offer me the isolation I craved, a chance to face my inner demons away from the chaos of everyday life. I didn't know that the deepest terror lay not only in the recesses of my mind, but also in the dark heart of the forest. I set off on a brisk October morning in my creaky old RV, a vehicle that had seen better days. Its engine coughed and spluttered as if warning me of the journey ahead, and the flickering interior lights hinted at impending technical failures. The RV was barely holding together, and the malfunctioning heater left me shivering during the chill of early dusk. But I was determined. I had left behind a life full of guilt and regret, and I believed that a few days alone in nature would be enough to begin mending my battered soul. The road into Cuyahoga Valley was a winding ribbon of asphalt, framed by skeletal trees and mist that clung to the ground like memories. I parked the RV in a secluded clearing near a narrow trail, a place that promised both beauty and isolation. The first day passed in a quiet, reflective haze. I spent my time unpacking, setting up a small camp outside the RV, and wandering the park's winding trails. But as dusk began to fall, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was amiss. That first night, as I sat by a small campfire trying to stave off the chill, I caught a glimpse of my reflection in a puddle nearby. At first, I merely noted the tired lines on my face, but then I saw something odd. My reflection seemed to linger a fraction longer than I did, its eyes glinting with an emotion I couldn't quite decipher. I dismissed it as a trick of the light and my own weariness. Yet, as the hours passed, more unsettling signs began to punctuate the silence of the forest. The next morning, I discovered a set of footprints around the campsite, footprints that didn't match my own. They were smaller, too light and precise, as if made by someone or something with the exact shape and movement of a person. I tried to convince myself that perhaps a wild animal had mimicked the pattern of my steps in the soft, damp earth, but a part of me felt that this was no natural occurrence. The forest, usually so comforting in its embrace, had grown menacing. Over the following days, the subtle anomalies escalated. I would catch glimpses of movement in the peripheral shadows, and each time I turned I found nothing but the dark, silent trees. But it wasn't until I started noticing the reflections that the sense of dread truly took hold. I began to see my reflection in the RV's windows and even in the polished surfaces of the interior, but with slight differences. Sometimes a half smile when I was expressionless, sometimes a pause after I moved on. It was as if there were two of me, a duplicate that moved on its own accord. One night, after a long day of hiking through the dense trails, I returned to the RV only to see, for a fleeting moment, a figure standing at the far end of the dimly lit interior. I froze, heart pounding, and slowly approached. In the mirror of the side door I saw it, a perfect copy of myself, identical in every detail, but with eyes that held an eerie, predatory gleam. The doppelganger vanished as soon as I blinked, leaving behind a cold sweat and a lingering question: who or what was following me? My mind spiraled into paranoia. Every creak of the RV, every gust of wind rattling the loose panels, fed the growing belief that something was deliberately imitating me, feeding on my guilt and unresolved grief. I tried to rationalize the experience, chalking it up to stress and sleep deprivation. But deep down, I knew that this was something far more sinister. Desperate for answers, I visited the small local library in a nearby town. I spent hours poring over old newspapers and folklore, trying to find any mention of doppelgangers or similar phenomena in the region. That's when I met Harold, an elderly park ranger with a weathered face and a quiet demeanor. Over a cup of bitter coffee in the library's dusty reading room, I confided my experiences. Harold listened intently, his eyes narrowing as he recalled an old legend. A curse borne by those burdened with overwhelming guilt, doomed to be haunted by a mirror image, a living embodiment of their darkest impulses and regrets. According to Harold, this curse was not merely a haunting apparition but a dangerous force that could slowly usurp one's identity if left unchecked. The only way to break it, he said in a hushed tone, was to confront one's inner demons head-on, to acknowledge and atone for past sins through a ritual of release. His words stirred something within me, a mix of fear and a reluctant determination to confront the part of myself that I had long denied. Returning to my RV with this newfound knowledge, I felt a shifting in the atmosphere. The forest seemed to watch me with a silent judgment, and my every movement was mirrored by the fleeting shadow of my doppelganger. Nights became a blur of restless sleep, punctuated by the sound of my own footsteps echoing in empty corridors of thought. Every time I caught a glimpse of that figure in a window or reflection, it was as if it were daring me to face the guilt that had driven me into isolation. On the third night, after a particularly harrowing day of eerie encounters, I decided that I had to take action. The old legend spoke of a clearing deep in the forest, a place where the curse could be confronted and, perhaps, broken. Armed with only a small notebook, a pen, and the weight of my regrets, I set off on foot into the heart of the park, leaving the unreliable RV behind in a clearing that no longer felt safe. The trek was arduous. The forest was dense and dark, the trees looming overhead like silent sentinels. I followed a narrow, winding path that Harold had described, the landscape around me gradually transforming into a more ominous terrain. The air grew colder, and a palpable tension pressed in on me from all sides. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being led not only by the legend, but also by the persistent presence of my doppelganger. Eventually, I reached a secluded clearing dominated by a ring of ancient boulders, a natural stone circle that radiated a sinister energy. The clearing was bathed in the eerie glow of the moon, its silvery light casting long, twisted shadows that seemed to move of their own volition. In that moment, every instinct screamed at me to turn back, yet I knew that this was the place where I had to confront my own darkness. I sat in the center of the circle, pulling out the notebook and pen. With trembling hands, I began to write down every regret, every moment of guilt that had accumulated over the years. The missed opportunities, the words left unsaid, the mistakes that had haunted me. The process was agonizingly painful, each word a dagger to my already wounded soul, but I persisted, pouring out the sorrow that had festered in my heart. As I finished writing, I recalled Harold's words, that to break the curse one must let go of the past in a symbolic act of release. I tore the pages from the notebook and, with a deep, shuddering breath, set them ablaze with a small branch from the clearing's edge. The flames flickered weakly at first, but soon they caught hold of the paper, sending curling tendrils of smoke into the cold night air. In that moment, as the last vestiges of paper burned away, I felt a shift, a subtle yet profound change that seemed to ripple through the very fabric of the clearing. The shadows around me stilled, and the oppressive atmosphere lightened, if only for an instant. I thought I saw in the smoke a reflection of my own face dissolving into nothingness, as if the burden I had carried was finally being released. But then, from the edge of the circle, the air crackled with an unnatural energy. I turned to see the doppelganger emerging from the shadows, a perfect mirror of myself, but with eyes that burned with anger and sorrow. The figure stepped into the moonlight, its features contorting as if struggling against an unseen force. For a long, agonizing moment, we stood facing each other, two halves of a shattered soul locked in a silent, desperate confrontation. The doppelganger spoke, not in words, but in a chorus of whispers that echoed with the collective weight of my regrets. Every whispered syllable was a memory, every murmur a moment of guilt that I had long buried. The sound was overwhelming, a cacophony that threatened to drown out my own heartbeat. In that surreal confrontation, I was forced to relive every moment of pain and loss, every mistake that had led me to this cursed solitude. Summoning every ounce of strength I possessed, I stepped forward. "I see you," I said aloud, my voice trembling but resolute. "I acknowledge you, and I acknowledge all that I have done." My words, raw and unfiltered, hung in the air as I continued. "I forgive myself, and I beg for the forgiveness that I have denied for too long." The act of speaking my truth, of confronting the very essence of my guilt, was both excruciating and liberating. For a moment, the doppelganger's expression softened, as if in silent acknowledgement of my plea. The forest seemed to hold its breath, and the oppressive tension began to ease. Then, as if caught in a final battle between darkness and light, the doppelganger wavered. The figure's edges blurred and began to dissipate, like smoke scattered by a sudden gust of wind. The whispers faded, replaced by a profound silence that resonated with the sound of my own heartbeat. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, the clearing bathed in a cold, gentle glow that slowly pushed back the darkness. The curse, the malevolent force that had haunted me for so long, was receding. I knew that the process wasn't instantaneous. The weight of my past would never vanish entirely. But in that moment, I felt a fragile peace seep into my soul, a promise that I could finally begin to heal. I made my way back to the RV, the forest around me now less ominous and more like a silent witness to my journey. The unreliable engine and flickering lights of the RV still reminded me of my vulnerability, but they no longer filled me with dread. Instead, I saw them as symbols of a life that was imperfect yet salvageable, a life that I was determined to rebuild, one honest day at a time. In the days that followed, the supernatural disturbances gradually subsided. I spent long hours in quiet reflection, documenting every moment in my journal. The memory of the doppelganger, once a source of paralyzing fear, transformed into a symbol of the darkness I had overcome. I continued my journey in the park with a newfound resolve, understanding that while the shadows of my past might always linger at the edge of my vision, I had the strength to face them. Even now, as I write these words in the solitude of my RV, I can still recall that fateful clearing in the heart of Cuyahoga Valley. The forest taught me that the line between reality and folklore is as thin as the whisper of a leaf on the wind, and that sometimes the greatest enemy we face is the one within. My name is Ryan Brooks, and though I once was haunted by my own reflection, I have learned to embrace the scars of my past and look forward with cautious hope. The curse may have left its mark, but I now walk with the conviction that even the darkest doppelganger can be vanquished when we dare to confront the truth within ourselves. That autumn, amid the shadows of ancient trees and the silent echoes of my regrets, I found a way to reclaim my identity. And while the journey toward healing is never truly complete, I now know that I am more than the sum of my guilt, a lesson etched in the quiet, enduring heart of the wilderness. My name is Sarah Caldwell, and I am 29 years old. This all happened last December when I embarked on what I hoped would be the breakthrough story of my career, and perhaps a path to healing my own wounds. I had recently lost someone very dear, and the pain of that loss had driven me into an obsession with uncovering hidden truths. As an investigative journalist, I'd heard whispers of a decades-old legend about a vengeful witch whose spirit haunted Blackwater Creek in Mohican State Park, Ohio. I decided to follow that legend into the heart of early winter, a season when the land itself seemed to shudder beneath the weight of its own sorrow. I pulled my aging RV off a narrow gravel road at the edge of an abandoned homestead near Blackwater Creek. The vehicle creaked and groaned as if protesting the chill that had seeped into every corner of its frame. Inside, the flickering lights and malfunctioning heater did little to dispel the oppressive cold. The radio, my only connection to the outside world, intermittently emitted distorted voices and static that gave me an eerie premonition that I was far from ordinary. Yet, despite these setbacks, I pressed on. I had a mission: to document the paranormal and, in the process, confront the ghosts of my own past. The homestead itself was a relic of another era, its peeling paint and broken windows silently testifying to years of neglect. I set up my base camp in the RV, right across from the dilapidated house, and began my investigation. The locals I encountered in a nearby town were cautious, their eyes darting nervously when I mentioned Blackwater Creek and the witch's curse. They offered only fragmented, fearful recollections of the legend, stories of a woman who had been brutally wronged, executed by settlers in a fit of hysteria, and doomed to wander the woods in endless torment. That first night, as I settled into the RV with my notebook and recorder, the wind howled like a chorus of lost souls. I sat at a rickety table reviewing my plan to capture evidence of the witch's spirit. I had set up my camera, voice recorder, and a makeshift EMF detector, all of which already had a reputation for being as temperamental as the weather. The heater sputtered and died repeatedly, and the radio crackled with inexplicable interference. Despite these technical difficulties, I felt a thrill of anticipation that mixed with a profound sense of loneliness. At midnight, while reviewing some local archives on my laptop, I heard it. A series of static-laced whispers that seemed to call my name. I froze. The voices were low and indistinct, like a chorus of murmurs from another world, and they came through on a frequency that my radio had never picked up before. I grabbed the recorder and played back the sound. The message was too garbled to make out clearly, but one thing was undeniable. Someone or something was trying to speak to me. The following morning, I ventured out into the frigid dawn. I walked along a narrow path leading towards Blackwater Creek. The ground was damp with frost, and a fine mist hung over the water, lending the landscape an ethereal quality. As I approached the creek, I noticed peculiar circular footprints pressed into the soft earth along the water's edge. They were unlike any animal tracks I had seen, neither human nor deer, but something in between, as if made by a pair of unseen spectral feet. My heart pounded, and I took careful notes and photographs. These prints were my first tangible evidence that the legend might be more than mere folklore. Later that day, back at the RV, I discovered something even more unnerving. Etched crudely into a large rock near the creek were symbols, ancient runes that matched the descriptions I'd read about in local historical accounts. They were dark, deliberate, and exuded a palpable sense of foreboding. I could almost feel the sorrow and rage imbued in those marks, a testament to the deep injustice the witch had suffered. As twilight descended, the atmosphere shifted once again. I had spent the day combing through dusty records in the abandoned homestead and interviewing a few hesitant locals who recounted eerie encounters near Blackwater Creek. Their stories were filled with half-remembered details: a spectral figure appearing by the water, sudden drops in temperature, and mysterious lights flickering in the distance. I felt that same inexplicable pull, as if I were treading on hallowed ground where past and present converged. That night, while I set up my camera by the creek, I noticed a figure in the periphery of my vision. A woman in tattered clothing standing silently by the water. I blinked, and when I looked again, she was gone. My breath caught in my throat and I hurried back to the RV. Inside, I tried to calm my racing heart by reviewing the footage. The recordings were grainy, but in one frame I distinctly saw a face, sorrowful eyes that seemed to hold centuries of pain, and a pallor that spoke of death and despair. I couldn't shake the feeling that this spirit was reaching out to me, perhaps even trying to share her story. Determined to learn more, I spent the next few days investigating the homestead's surroundings. In a dusty corner of the old house, I uncovered a hidden compartment beneath a creaking floorboard. Inside, wrapped in faded cloth, was a leather-bound diary. Its pages, yellowed with age, detailed the life of a woman named Eliza Blackwood, a name that matched the local legend. Eliza had been accused of witchcraft, betrayed by those she had once trusted, and executed in a fit of hysteria. The diary described her last moments in agonizing detail, her final words a curse that bound her spirit to the land. It spoke of injustice, betrayal, and an undying need for retribution. Reading her words, I felt her anguish, as if the diary was a conduit for her tortured soul. Armed with this newfound evidence, my investigation took on a personal urgency. The diary was not just a historical document, it was a cry for help, a plea for someone to right a wrong that had festered for centuries. As I delved deeper into Eliza's tragic past, I began to see parallels with my own loss. The isolation and despair I had been drowning in seemed to mirror her sorrow. It was as if the forest had chosen me to bear witness to her story, to help her find the justice she had been denied in life. One particularly cold, windswept night, I set up a makeshift ritual in the clearing near the homestead. Drawing upon the clues from Eliza's diary, I arranged a small circle of salt and candles around an ancient oak tree near Blackwater Creek. I recited the protective verses I had painstakingly pieced together from the diary, my voice trembling in the frigid air. The ritual was my desperate attempt to reach out to Eliza's spirit, to soothe her anguish and, perhaps, find some measure of closure for my own grief. For a long, tense moment, nothing happened. Then, the temperature seemed to drop even further, and the wind howled with a fury that made the flames of the candles dance wildly. In that tumultuous moment, I felt a presence, a cold, sorrowful energy that pressed against me like a physical force. The air shimmered, and from the darkness emerged the spectral figure of a woman. Her face was a mask of grief and fury, her eyes burning with an intensity that both terrified and captivated me. "Eliza?" I whispered, not sure if the spirit could understand my words or if it was simply the wind playing tricks on my mind. For what felt like an eternity, the ghostly figure regarded me silently, her expression shifting from sorrow to something like resignation. Then, as if in response to my silent plea, she moved closer, her form wavering like a reflection in disturbed water. I could see the outlines of tattered clothing, and the faint smell of smoke and earth clung to her as she passed. The encounter was brief, a mere moment of connection before she vanished into the night, leaving behind only the echo of her sorrow and the lingering chill of her presence. In the aftermath of that encounter, I felt a mix of relief and lingering dread. I had touched the edge of something far larger than my own grief, a tragic narrative of injustice and spectral retribution. Yet, as the days wore on, I could sense that the spirit's visit was not a final farewell. The supernatural occurrences escalated. Strange sounds in the dead of night, inexplicable drops in temperature, and the constant, eerie feeling of being watched by unseen eyes. Late one evening, as I was recording ambient sounds by the creek, the radio suddenly burst into life with a series of garbled messages. Amid the static, I discerned phrases that chilled me to the bone, words of warning and despair that seemed to be recited in a broken, desperate cadence. The messages spoke of betrayal, unfulfilled justice, and the enduring curse that had claimed Eliza Blackwood's life. My heart pounded as I recorded the message, the spectral voice intertwining with the howling wind. It was a message meant for me, urging me to continue my quest for truth and to help the restless spirit find peace. Driven by a newfound determination, I resolved to confront the source of the curse directly. The diary had hinted that the witch's spirit was bound to a particular site near the creek, a small clearing where the final act of betrayal had taken place. I spent hours combing through the dense undergrowth, guided by the faded maps and cryptic references in the diary. Finally, I arrived at a clearing encircled by ancient trees whose gnarled branches twisted skyward like desperate hands. In the center lay a shallow grave, marked by a simple, weathered stone inscribed with the name Eliza Blackwood. Standing there, in the biting cold, and beneath a sky heavy with winter's sorrow, I felt the weight of centuries pressing upon me. I knew that if I were to bring peace to Eliza's tormented soul, and in turn find some semblance of healing for my own wounded heart, I needed to perform one final act of redemption. Drawing upon the ritual verses from the diary, I began a solemn incantation, my voice steady despite the tears that blurred my vision. I called upon the forces of nature and the lingering power of justice to release Eliza from the chains of her cursed existence. As I spoke the final words, the wind howled louder, and the very earth beneath my feet seemed to tremble. In that charged moment I saw her again, the spectral figure of Eliza, standing before me in all her tragic glory. Her eyes, once filled with seething anger, now softened with a profound sadness. For a moment, the gap between the living and the dead narrowed, and I felt her sorrow and pain mingle with my own. It was as if our souls recognized a shared anguish, a bond forged by loss and the desperate need for closure. Then, as suddenly as she had appeared, she faded away, leaving behind an almost tangible silence. The air grew calm, and the oppressive weight that had hung over the clearing seemed to lift. I remained there for a long while, alone with my thoughts, the only sound the gentle lapping of Blackwater Creek against its banks. In the days that followed, I gathered all the evidence I could, recordings, photographs, and the diary that now felt like a sacred relic. My equipment continued to falter at times, and the RV's unreliable heater and flickering lights were constant reminders of my isolation. Yet, I no longer felt alone in that desolate landscape. I had forged a connection with a spirit who, despite her tragic fate, had entrusted me with her story. When I finally packed up and drove away from Mohican State Park, the weight of the experience lingered in every mile. The road stretched out before me, a ribbon of possibility cutting through the snow-covered wilderness, and behind me, the ghost of Eliza Blackwood, and the echoes of a long-forgotten injustice faded into the distance. I knew that the questions I had sought answers to would haunt me for years to come. Had I truly helped set her free, or had I merely momentarily appeased a restless spirit destined to return? The ambiguity of that final encounter left me with more questions than answers, and an enduring sense of unease. Even now, as I travel the highways of a world far removed from that haunted creek, I still hear faint echoes of her voice in the static of my radio on cold nights. I have come to accept that some tragedies echo across time, leaving imprints on both the living and the dead. My journey into the heart of Blackwater was as much about uncovering a historical injustice as it was about confronting my own grief and loneliness. I share my story not merely as a chronicle of supernatural encounters, but as a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. In the solitude of Mohican State Park, I discovered that sometimes the search for truth is intertwined with the search for redemption. The witch's curse, the spectral warnings on the radio, and the whispered messages from the past. All of them led me to a deeper understanding of the pain that binds us across generations. My name is Sarah Caldwell, and I set out to capture the elusive truth behind a vengeful witch's curse. I found more than I had bargained for, a sorrowful spirit in need of justice, and a part of myself that I had long been afraid to face. As I drive away in my aging RV, the memories of that wintry night and the haunting visage of Eliza Blackwood remain etched in my soul, a reminder that the past is never truly dead. It lingers in the cold wind, in the soft murmur of a creek, and in the silent spaces between our heartbeats, forever calling us to remember and, perhaps, to heal. My name is Evelyn Stone. I'm 29 years old, and this all happened last autumn when I sought escape and renewal in the remote wilds of Devil's Hollow in Scioto County, Ohio. I had just come off a painful breakup that left my heart heavy and my spirit fractured. I craved solitude, a chance to leave the chaos behind and rebuild who I was, even if only in the quiet company of ancient trees and whispering winds. I set off in my battered RV, a temperamental relic that sputtered to life each morning with a groan and a flash of warning lights. The engine was unreliable, the interior lights flickered at the worst possible moments, and the heater barely managed to hold back the chill of the encroaching autumn nights. Yet I welcomed these flaws. They somehow echoed the imperfection I felt inside, as if the vehicle were an honest companion on my journey of self-reclamation. After a long, winding drive that took me deep into the heart of Scioto County, I finally arrived at a secluded clearing near Devil's Hollow. The area was notorious among locals, a place shrouded in superstition and mystery. I parked the RV beside a copse of gnarled trees, their trunks marked with both indigenous symbols and strange arcane sigils that I could barely decipher. The sight sent a shiver down my spine, but I brushed it off as local lore meant to keep outsiders at bay. The first day passed in quiet introspection. I set up a modest camp outside the RV and spent hours wandering the nearby trails, absorbing the somber beauty of the forest. The crisp air and rustling leaves filled me with a tentative hope that I might mend what was broken. Yet, as dusk fell, an unsettling stillness descended on the land. The wind no longer whispered comfortingly. Instead, it carried murmurs that hinted at secrets best left undisturbed. That first night, as I sat by a small campfire struggling against the biting cold, I began to hear soft voices on the wind, whispers that seemed to call my name in halting, fragmented phrases. I told myself it was nothing more than the wind's eerie song, but deep in my gut, I sensed that something was not right. As I returned to the RV to retire, I noticed that the temperature inside had plummeted. The faulty heater had finally given out, leaving me shivering in darkness, lit only by the intermittent flicker of the dashboard lights. In the following days, more unsettling signs began to punctuate my solitude. I discovered odd carvings on the bark of trees near my campsite, symbols that combined indigenous motifs with unfamiliar, foreboding markings. I recalled overhearing local stories at a gas station about ancient curses and vengeful spirits that roamed these parts. Each new carving made my skin crawl, and every rustle in the underbrush felt like footsteps closing in. One afternoon, while exploring a narrow trail that led deeper into Devil's Hollow, I stumbled upon a dilapidated cabin hidden among overgrown brambles. Its windows were dark and empty, and the wood was weathered by time. Drawn by an inexplicable impulse, I pushed open the creaking door and stepped inside. Amid the dusty remnants of a bygone era, I found a tattered grimoire bound in worn leather. The pages, yellowed with age, recounted the legend of the bitter witch, a once kind indigenous healer betrayed by early settlers, cursed to wander Devil's Hollow as a vengeful spirit. The grimoire told her story in sorrowful detail, how she had once used her healing gifts to nurture her people, only to be forsaken when her warnings of impending doom were ignored. The betrayal had twisted her benevolence into bitter malice, and in her anguish she vowed to punish any who trespassed on her sacred ground. The book ended with instructions for a ritual, a dangerous rite that, if performed correctly, might either appease her wrath or banish her forever. I couldn't help but feel that fate had led me to that cabin for a reason. That night, back at my RV, the atmosphere grew even more oppressive. The air seemed to thicken with a malevolent presence. I sat alone in the dim interior, the failing lights casting eerie shadows that danced along the walls. It was then that I first saw her, a spectral figure, an elderly woman draped in tattered clothing, standing at the edge of my vision. Her eyes, filled with sorrow and a desperate urgency, silently pleaded with me to leave. I blinked, and she vanished into the darkness, leaving only a lingering chill and a sense of profound warning. I tried to shake off the encounter as a trick of my weary mind, but as the nights progressed, the supernatural manifestations intensified. The wind carried not only soft voices but also harsh, accusatory whispers. The symbols carved on the trees seemed to glow faintly in the moonlight, and the grimoire's warnings echoed in my thoughts. It was as if the very fabric of Devil's Hollow was alive with the pain and anger of the bitter witch, and my presence had awakened her long-dormant fury. One particularly cold night, unable to bear the mounting dread, I decided to venture out of the RV and investigate a clearing that the grimoire had described as the heart of the curse. The RV's engine refused to start, so I left it behind and trudged through the forest on foot, my breath visible in the frigid air. The path was overgrown and treacherous, the only light coming from the ghostly glow of a full moon that filtered through the skeletal branches overhead. After what felt like hours of walking, I reached a clearing dominated by a circle of ancient boulders. The stones, slick with moss and lichen, formed a natural ring that exuded a palpable sense of foreboding. I could feel the weight of centuries pressing in around me, and the silence was broken only by the crunch of fallen leaves underfoot. I set down my backpack and unrolled a tattered blanket, feeling that this was the place where I needed to confront the darkness. Clutching the grimoire, I began to read aloud the incantations inscribed within its fragile pages, my voice trembling in the still night. As I recited the words, the temperature around me plummeted further, and the wind rose to a howl that seemed to carry the very anguish of the bitter witch. Shadows deepened and stretched, converging at the edge of the circle until, from the murk, a figure emerged. It was the bitter witch herself, an apparition of haunting beauty and sorrowful rage. Her form was both ethereal and disturbingly real, with wild, unkempt hair and eyes that burned with a sorrowful fury. The sight of her sent a jolt of terror through my veins, yet also a strange empathy. In that spectral gaze I saw the remnants of a kind healer twisted into an instrument of vengeance by centuries of betrayal and pain. "Leave this place," a voice seemed to whisper, echoing around the clearing. But I stood my ground, driven by a desperate need to understand and perhaps heal the ancient wound that had reached out for retribution. I continued the incantation, my voice gaining strength even as the wind threatened to tear the words from my lips. The ground trembled beneath me, and the bitter witch advanced, her ethereal form flickering like a candle in a storm. The confrontation that followed was a battle not of fists and fury, but of souls. With each word I uttered, I felt the weight of my own grief and abandonment, the scars of a past that had driven me to seek solace in isolation. The bitter witch's eyes glimmered with a mixture of pain and rage, as though she recognized a kindred spirit in my own suffering. But her anger was not meant for me alone. It was the embodiment of centuries of betrayal, a curse that demanded retribution for the wrongs of history. As the wind screamed and the night grew colder, I realized that the only way to break the cycle of bitterness was to offer my own act of contrition. Reaching into the depths of my backpack, I pulled out a small notebook in which I had scribbled the regrets and sorrows that had haunted me for years. The lost opportunities, the words left unspoken, the love that had slipped away. With trembling hands, I tore the pages free and, following the instructions from the grimoire, arranged them in the center of the stone circle. "By the weight of our sorrows and the light of forgiveness," I chanted, voice echoing into the darkness. I then lit the pages with a scrap of cloth and a match I'd brought along. As the paper curled in the flames, a profound silence fell over the clearing, The fire's glow danced over my face, illuminating tears that mingled with determination and sorrow. For a long, agonizing moment, the bitter witch hovered before me, her form wavering as if caught between worlds. Then, with a sudden, shuddering gasp, she spoke, not in words, but in a torrent of whispered memories. I could hear her pain, the betrayal, and the centuries of anguish that had twisted her into the vengeful spirit she now embodied. In that surreal moment, I felt her pain as my own, as if the boundaries between us had blurred, allowing me to see the wounded heart behind the spectral visage. "Forgive me," I said softly, voice laden with both regret and resolve. "I cannot undo the past, but I offer you my remorse and my hope for a new beginning." My words, fragile as they were, seemed to ripple through the clearing. The flames that had consumed my regrets flickered, and for a heartbeat the bitter witch's furious glare softened into something like acceptance. The oppressive chill began to recede, replaced by a tentative warmth that I had not felt in months. In that delicate balance between darkness and light, the bitter witch's form began to dissolve into the night. Her anguished eyes, once blazing with vengeance, dimmed to a sorrowful gleam before disappearing altogether, leaving me alone in the silent circle of stones. The wind died down to a gentle murmur, and the oppressive weight that had pressed upon my soul lifted, replaced by a fragile hope that maybe, just maybe, healing was possible. I stood there for several long minutes, absorbing the quiet aftermath. The grimoire lay at my feet, its secrets now part of my own journey of redemption. I felt no triumphant joy, only a somber understanding that both the bitter witch and I had suffered deeply, and that in our shared anguish there was the possibility of renewal. Reluctantly, I made my way back to the RV, the forest now seeming less hostile, though its ancient mystery still lingered in every shadow. The vehicle's engine, though still unreliable, sputtered back to life as if acknowledging my return. I drove slowly out of Devil's Hollow, the memories of that night etched indelibly in my heart. The road ahead was uncertain, but I knew that I had taken a crucial step toward reclaiming my life. In the days that followed, I continued to document my experiences in a worn journal, a tangible record of the transformation that had taken place in that haunted clearing. I never forgot the spectral warnings or the cold, unyielding grip of ancient sorrow, but I also carried with me the knowledge that forgiveness, both of oneself and of the past, was the key to breaking even the most vicious of curses. Looking back now, I realize that my journey to Devil's Hollow was not simply an escape from a broken relationship or a desperate bid for solitude. It was a confrontation with history, a reckoning with the lingering wounds of betrayal and the harsh legacy of those who had been wronged. The bitter witch was more than a malevolent force. She was a mirror reflecting the pain of a people, and a reminder that healing is only possible when we acknowledge the sorrow of the past. My time in Devil's Hollow changed me irrevocably. I left behind the shackles of my own grief and embraced a future where hope could flourish even in the face of ancient darkness. The RV remains a testament to that journey, a creaking, unreliable vessel that, like me, continues to press forward despite its flaws. And while the memory of that bitter night lingers in my dreams, it also serves as a quiet reminder that even the deepest wounds can begin to mend when we dare to confront them. Now, as I drive along quiet country roads with the cool autumn air in my window and the distant silhouettes of trees whispering secrets in the breeze, I know that I have forged a new path for myself. The legacy of the bitter witch, with all its sorrow and fury, has been transformed into a lesson in forgiveness and renewal. A lesson I carry with me every day, a reminder that the shadows of the past need not dictate the light of the future. Oh, 3 Mini.